The knife flashed in the winter sunlight, aimed directly at Margaret's swollen belly. Victor Sterling's face was twisted with rage as he lunged forward, chains rattling as he broke free from the deputies. "If I can't have that land, no one will." Ethan saw it happening. His wife, his unborn child, and he was too far away. Time slowed to a heartbeat. He had one choice, one impossible choice: throw himself between the blade and everything he loved. But this story doesn't start with a knife. It starts with a blizzard, a dying woman in the snow, and a giant everyone called a monster. The old man sat in his rocking chair on the cabin porch, watching the Appalachian sun sink behind the mountains he had known for 90 years. His hair was white as winter snow, his back curved with age, but even now bent and weathered, Ethan Blackwood still stood 7 feet 8 inches tall. The chair creaked beneath his weight as he rocked slowly, hands wrapped around a mug of coffee, gone cold. His grandson Jimmy sat cross-legged on the porch steps, 16 years old, and full of that restless energy youth brings. The boy had traveled from Charleston to visit, seeking stories his mother would never tell. Now, in the fading light of a June evening in 1942, he finally asked the question that had been burning in him since he arrived. "Grandpa, they say you once fought the richest man in West Virginia and won. They say you took on his whole company, his hired guns, the corrupt lawmen he owned. Is that true?" Ethan's weathered face cracked into a smile that held both sorrow and pride. He set down his coffee mug and looked at his grandson with eyes that had seen too much violence, too much loss, but also more love than most men ever know. "Boy, that's a story about the year I turned 32, when the world saw me as a monster. About the only woman who looked past my size and saw my soul. And about the time I had to choose between running away forever or fighting for everything I loved." The old man shifted in his chair, and for a moment the sunset caught his profile just right. Jimmy could see the ghost of the man his grandfather had been, still massive, still formidable, still carrying the weight of choices made 6 decades past. The story starts on a night in October 1884 during a blizzard that should have killed us both. I found her freezing to death in the snow, barely alive. I didn't know that saving her life would mean I'd have to risk my own. Ethan closed his eyes, and when he opened them again they were looking not at the present but at the past. His voice dropped lower, taking on the cadence of memory. "Let me tell you how it really happened." The world dissolved around them, the 1942 sunset fading into the cold October night of 1884. In that year, when Ethan Blackwood was 32 years old, he had long since given up hope of living anything resembling a normal life. He stood 8 feet tall in his worn leather boots, a giant among men in an age when the average height was 5'7". His shoulders were broad enough to block a doorway. His hands could palm a man's head like a melon. His arms, thick with muscle from years of chopping wood and hauling timber, looked carved from the mountain stone itself. But those who knew him, the rare few who bothered to look beyond his size, understood that beneath all that imposing muscle beat the heart of a gentle soul. He was Cherokee on his mother's side, white on his father's. His thick black hair hung past his shoulders, usually tied back with a leather cord his mother had braided years before her death. His beard was full and dark, already streaked with the first hints of silver, though he was barely past 30. His face was broad and strong, with high cheekbones that spoke of his mother's heritage and a jawline that could have been carved by the same hands that shaped the mountains. He moved through the forest with surprising grace for such a large man. His moccasins, made in the Cherokee way his mother had taught him, made barely a sound on the forest floor. Years of living alone in the wilderness had taught him to walk like a ghost, to read the land, to survive where softer men would perish. He lived by himself in a cabin high in the mountains 2 miles from the nearest neighbor. The cabin sat on a ridge overlooking the valley below, where the small town of Pine Hollow nestled among the trees. From his porch he could see smoke rising from 50 chimneys, could count the rooftops of the town that feared him. 300 souls lived there, most of them miners or farmers, scratching out a living from the stubborn mountain soil. They called him the Mountain Ghost. Parents used him to scare children into obedience. Men crossed the street when they saw him coming. Women clutched their purses and hurried past, eyes down, afraid to meet his gaze. Ethan had learned to live with the loneliness. He told himself it was enough. It had to be. He had been 10 years old when his mother finally told him the truth about his father. The man had taken one look at his oversized infant son and decided he wanted no part of raising what he called a half-breed freak. Those words spoken by his mother with such quiet pain had carved a wound in young Ethan's heart that never fully healed. He spent his childhood watching other boys with their fathers learning to fish and hunt and work the land together. Ethan learned those skills on his own through trial and error, with only his mother's encouragement to guide him. Ruby Blackwood had been a small woman with a fierce spirit barely reaching her son's chest even when he was 15. She worked herself to the bone, keeping their small plot of land productive after her husband left. She raised Ethan to be respectful, hardworking, and kind. When she died of pneumonia 5 winters ago, she had made him promise to find someone to share his life with. "You have too much love in you to waste it on just the animals," she had whispered with her last breath, her hand trembling in his massive palm. "Promise me you'll try to find a good woman who can see past that mountain of muscle to the gentle soul underneath." Ethan had promised, but keeping that promise proved harder than breaking wild horses. Most women in Pine Hollow were already married too young or frankly terrified of his size. The few who had shown interest seemed fascinated by his unusual stature rather than genuinely attracted to him as a person. They looked at him the way people looked at circus attractions. Curious, slightly repulsed, never with real warmth. At 32, he had resigned himself to bachelorhood. He had his cabin, his hunting, his wood carving, the small animal figures he created with surprising delicacy, the shelves full of books he'd taught himself to read, the quiet evenings by the fire listening to the wind in the pines. It was enough, he told himself. It had to be. On the other side of Pine Hollow, in the one-room schoolhouse that served the town's children, Miss Margaret Hayes was preparing for another day of teaching. At 43, she was what polite society called a spinster, though that term hardly did justice to the complex woman who had shaped young minds in Pine Hollow for the past 8 years. Margaret had arrived in town as a young widow. Her husband, Richard Hayes, had died of consumption just 2 years into their marriage. She had been 27, then still young enough to remarry and start a family. But something in her had closed off after Richard's death. Perhaps it was the way his illness had drained their small savings, leaving her with nothing but debts and memories. Perhaps it was the way his family back in Boston had blamed her for not taking better care of him, for not being wealthy enough to afford better doctors. The Hayes family had made it clear she was beneath their station, and when Richard died, they had severed all contact. She had not heard from them in 15 years and preferred to keep it that way. For not being wealthy enough to afford better doctors, for not being good enough for their son. Whatever the reason, she had thrown herself into teaching with the dedication of someone who had no other outlet for her nurturing instincts. This October morning, Margaret stood before her small mirror, pinning her graying brown hair into its customary neat bun. She had been beautiful once, and still was in the eyes of those who looked closely enough to see past the severe hairstyle and practical dresses. Her eyes were a warm hazel that could sparkle with humor or flash with indignation depending on the situation. Her hands were slender but strong, equally comfortable holding a piece of chalk or binding a child's scraped knee. Margaret had heard the stories about Ethan Blackwood, of course. In a town the size of Pine Hollow, everyone knew everyone else's business. She knew he was Cherokee and white, that he stood impossibly tall, that he lived alone in the mountains. She knew he was decent and hard-working, that he had never caused trouble or treated anyone poorly. Their paths had crossed occasionally over the years. He would tip his hat politely when they passed on the street, and she would nod in acknowledgement, nothing more. Once, when her schoolhouse roof had been damaged in a spring storm 2 years prior, he had arrived with his tools and materials and spent 2 days repairing it, refusing any payment beyond a jar of her homemade preserves. "Seems wrong to let the children's learning suffer on account of a leaky roof," he had said simply, his deep voice barely above a whisper, as if he were afraid his words might carry too much weight. Margaret had watched him work from her classroom window, noting the careful precision with which he handled even the smallest tasks. His massive hands had somehow managed delicate repairs that would have challenged men half his size. There was something almost artistic in the way he worked, she had thought at the time, though she quickly dismissed such fanciful notions. The comfortable distance that Margaret and Ethan had maintained for years was about to become impossible to sustain. October of 1884 brought an early winter to the Appalachian Mountains, and with it came a crisis that would throw them together in ways neither could have imagined. On the morning of October 28th, Dr. Morrison, the town's only physician, received word that a child at a farm 15 miles out had come down with a dangerous fever. The old doctor, 72 years old, with hands that had started shaking badly in recent months, saddled his horse immediately. In these mountains, delays could mean death when it came to children's fevers. But Dr. Morrison's heart, weakened by 7 decades of hard living and harder winters, gave out before he reached the sick child. They found him collapsed near Miller's Creek, his horse standing guard over his body, patient and confused. The news reached town by mid-morning. Martha Collins, the blacksmith's wife, burst through the schoolhouse door while Margaret was in the middle of a geography lesson. The children looked up, startled by the intrusion. Dr. Morrison's horse came back without him. Martha gasped, her face pale with worry. They found him collapsed near the creek. His heart gave out. Margaret, you have medical training. The Hartley child at the farm 15 miles out needs help now, and you're the only one who can go. Margaret felt her own heart hammering. She had learned basic medicine from Dr. Morrison over the years, absorbing knowledge about setting bones and treating fevers during their long conversations. The old doctor had been teaching her, she realized now, preparing her for this possibility. But she had never claimed to be a healer. She was a teacher, nothing more. Still, a child's life hung in the balance. There was no one else. 20 minutes later, Margaret was on horseback, riding hard toward the Morrison farm. She carried Dr. Morrison's medical bag, hastily retrieved from his office. The leather was worn smooth from decades of use, and holding it made her feel both honored and terrified. The sky had been clear when she left town, a crisp autumn morning with the leaves turning gold and red on the mountainsides. But mountain weather changed faster than city folk could imagine. Dark clouds rolled in from the north, bringing with them the sharp scent of snow. The temperature dropped 10 degrees in as many minutes. She was still 5 miles from the Hartley farm when the first snowflakes began to fall. Within minutes, it became a full blizzard. The wind howled through the trees like a living thing, driving snow so thick she could barely see her horse's ears. The temperature plummeted to 15 below zero. The trail disappeared beneath a blanket of white that grew deeper with every passing second. Margaret's horse began to panic, dancing sideways, whinnying in fear. She tried to calm the animal, but her own hands were numb with cold. Her fingers gripping the reins had lost all feeling. She could see her breath in great white clouds, could feel ice forming on her eyelashes. The horse reared, suddenly terrified by something Margaret couldn't see. She felt herself falling through the white void. She hit the snow hard, her ankle twisting beneath her weight. Pain shot up her leg, sharp and immediate. The horse bolted, disappearing into the storm, leaving her alone in the killing cold. Margaret tried to stand, but her ankle would not bear her weight. She crawled toward what she hoped was a tree, something to shelter behind. The wind cut through her wool coat like it was made of paper. Snow caked her eyelashes, her eyebrows, the hair that had come loose from its pins. Her fingers had gone beyond numb to a dangerous absence of feeling. She knew what that meant. Frostbite, hypothermia, death. She thought of her students back in Pine Hollow, their bright young faces. She thought of the Morrison child who needed her help. She thought of dying alone in the snow, of how they would find her frozen body when the storm passed, if they found her at all. A strange calm settled over her. This was how it ended then. 43 years of playing it safe, of keeping her heart locked away after Richard's death, of convincing herself that a quiet, solitary life was enough. What a waste, she thought, as her eyes drifted closed. What a terrible waste. But Margaret Hayes was not meant to die that day. 3 miles from his cabin, Ethan Blackwood had been tracking a deer when the storm hit. A man of lesser experience might have been caught off guard, but Ethan had learned to read the mountains from his Cherokee mother. He had seen the signs in the morning sky, in the way the birds flew south, with unusual urgency in the nervous stamping of his horses when he fed them at dawn. He had known the blizzard was coming, and he had started back toward his cabin early. He was less than a mile from home when he heard a sound that made him stop dead in his tracks. A horse's frightened whinny coming from the direction of the main trail. No one should have been out in this weather, no one with any sense anyway. But Ethan knew that sometimes necessity drove people to take foolish risks. He changed direction, moving toward the sound with long ground-eating strides. His height, usually a burden in cramped spaces, became an advantage in the deep snow. Where a normal-sized man would have been hip-deep and struggling, Ethan's powerful legs carried him forward with relative ease. He found the horse first, a brown mare trembling with fear reins trailing in the snow. The horse was saddled, which meant a rider somewhere nearby. Ethan scanned the white landscape, his dark eyes searching for any sign of movement. Then he saw it, a dark shape against the snow barely visible in the storm, a woman's cloak. Ethan reached Margaret in 4 long strides. She was unconscious, her face pale as the snow around her, her lips already taking on a dangerous blue tint. He did not hesitate. In the mountains, hesitation meant death. He scooped her up in his arms, marveling at how small and light she felt. Her head lolled against his chest. Her breathing was shallow and rapid. He had to get her warm, fast. Ethan turned and ran toward his cabin, carrying Margaret as easily as another man might carry a child. Behind him, he heard the low growl of wolves drawn by the scent of vulnerability. Mountain wolves were dangerous in winter, desperate and hungry. He stopped long enough to let out a roar that echoed off the mountains. It was a sound that was half human and half something more primal. A sound that came from deep in his chest and carried all the fury of a man protecting what was his. The wolves melted back into the storm. Even predators knew better than to challenge the mountain ghost. His cabin appeared through the swirling snow like a promise of salvation. Ethan kicked open the door and carried Margaret straight to his bed, the only place warm enough to save her. He had built the cabin himself, and the thick log walls kept out the worst of the weather. The fire in his stone hearth had burned down to coals, but it was still putting out heat. He worked quickly, his large hands surprisingly gentle. He removed Margaret's wet cloak and boots, the sodden wool stockings beneath. Her traveling dress was damp, but not soaked through, so he left it on, covering her instead with his warmest blankets. Heavy wool and bear fur that he had cured himself layered thick enough to trap her body heat. He stoked the fire until flames leaped high, filling the cabin with warmth and golden light. Then he put water on to boil, adding herbs his mother had taught him about. Willow bark for pain, yarrow to encourage warmth back into cold limbs, golden seal to fight infection. While the tea steeped, he examined Margaret's ankle, swollen and already bruising but not broken. A bad sprain, nothing more. He bound it carefully with strips of clean cloth, wrapping it firmly, but not too tight. For the first time since finding her, Ethan allowed himself to really look at the woman he had rescued. He recognized her, of course. Miss Margaret Hayes, the schoolteacher. He had seen her in town always proper and reserved her hair in that severe bun, her dresses practical and unadorned. But now, with her hair coming loose from its pins, damp tendrils curling around her face, she looked younger, vulnerable, beautiful. Margaret's eyes fluttered open. For a moment she stared at the ceiling, confused. Then her gaze found Ethan, who was sitting in a chair near the bed, and her eyes went wide. "Where am I?" she whispered. Her voice was hoarse, barely audible. "Who are you?" "You're safe," Ethan said, keeping his voice low and gentle. "I'm Ethan Blackwood. I found you in the storm. You were freezing to death." Recognition flickered across her face. "The mountain man they talk about." Ethan nodded, not sure if that was meant as a compliment or an accusation. "Some call me that. Most avoid me. You should rest now." Margaret tried to sit up, then gasped as pain shot through her ankle. Ethan was beside her in an instant, his large hand gently pressing her back down against the pillows. "Your ankle is sprained," he said. "You need to keep it elevated and still. I've made tea that will help with the pain." He brought her the cup, supporting her head with one hand while she drank with the other. The tea was bitter, but Margaret sipped it obediently, studying his face as she did. Up close, she could see the intelligence in his dark eyes, the kindness in the lines around his mouth, the gentleness in the way he held her as if she were made of spun glass. "Thank you," she said quietly when she finished the tea. "You saved my life." Ethan shrugged, uncomfortable with gratitude. "Mountain takes care of mountain folk. The storm won't pass until morning. You should sleep." But Margaret was looking around the cabin now, her teacher's eye noting details. The space was clean and well organized. Shelves lined one wall holding books and tools. On a workbench near the window she saw wood shavings and what looked like half-finished carvings. Small animals beautifully detailed. A bear, a deer, an owl with wings spread wide. "You carve," she said, pointing with her chin since her hands were wrapped around the warm teacup. Ethan glanced at his workbench, then back at her. "My mother taught me. She said big hands like mine needed to learn gentleness." He walked to the bench and picked up a small wooden bear no larger than a child's fist. The detail was exquisite. Every claw, every tuft of fur carved with obvious love and skill. He brought it to Margaret and placed it in her hand. "For you," he said, "to remember you survived." Margaret stared at the small bear, then at Ethan's face. In all her 43 years, no one had ever given her something so thoughtful, so personal. Her late husband had bought her jewelry on their anniversary, expensive pieces chosen by a jeweler. But this rough wooden bear, carved by hands the size of dinner plates, touched something deep in her heart. "This is beautiful work," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Where did you learn such skill?" Ethan settled back into his chair, uncomfortable with the attention, but warmed by her genuine appreciation. "Long winter evenings, not much else to do up here. Mother said creating beauty keeps the soul from going cold." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the only sounds the crackling fire and the wind howling outside. Margaret felt warmth slowly returning to her limbs, though her ankle throbbed with persistent pain. She watched Ethan over the rim of her teacup, noting how carefully he moved, despite his size, how he kept a respectful distance. "I know who you are," Ethan said suddenly. "You're the teacher, Margaret Hayes. Kids talk about the woman who reads them adventure stories, makes learning fun." Margaret felt herself blushing, pleased that her work had been noticed. "You come to town then? I didn't think you left the mountain much." "Sometimes. At night when folks don't stare." There was no self-pity in his voice, just a statement of fact. But Margaret heard the loneliness beneath the words, recognized it because it matched her own. "People fear what they don't understand," she said softly. "They see your size and forget to look for the person underneath." Ethan met her eyes, then really met them for the first time. "Most people never bother to look." "Well," Margaret said, managing a small smile despite her pain and exhaustion, "I'm looking now, and I see a man who carves beauty from wood and saves foolish teachers from dying in blizzards. That's not someone to fear, Mr. Blackwood. That's someone to thank." Something shifted in the air between them. A wall coming down, a connection forming. Ethan felt it, though he did not have words for it. This woman lying in his bed with her ankle wrapped and her hair coming loose from its pins, saw him. Not the giant, not the half-breed, just Ethan. The storm raged through the night wind, howling like wolves around the cabin walls. Margaret drifted in and out of sleep, waking occasionally to find Ethan tending the fire or checking her ankle. Each time she woke, he would bring her water or more of the herbal tea, his massive presence somehow comforting rather than frightening. By morning the blizzard had passed, leaving behind a world transformed by 3 feet of fresh snow. The sun rose bright and cold, turning the snow to diamonds. Ethan helped Margaret to a chair by the fire while he prepared a simple breakfast of cornmeal porridge and dried venison. She watched him move around the kitchen area, noting how he had to duck beneath the ceiling beams, how carefully he handled the delicate china cups that looked like toys in his enormous hands. "The trail will be passable by afternoon," he said, not looking at her as he stirred the pot. "I can take you back to town, then." Margaret felt a strange disappointment at his words, though she could not have explained why. Of course she needed to return to town. Her students would be worried. Martha Collins would have the whole town searching for her by now. The Morrison child. Had anyone reached the Morrison child? That would be kind, she said. The Morrison child, though. I was riding to help when the storm caught me. "Dr. Morrison died yesterday morning," Ethan said quietly. His heart. "But I heard in town last week that the child's fever broke on its own. Sometimes the body heals itself if given time." Margaret felt relief mixed with sorrow. Relief that the child had survived. Sorrow for the old doctor who had been her friend and mentor. And another feeling she did not want to examine too closely. A selfish gratitude that circumstances had brought her to this cabin, to this man. They ate in companionable silence, and then Ethan went out to clear a path and ready his horse for the journey back to town. Margaret sat by the fire studying the cabin in the morning light. She noticed things she had missed in her exhaustion the night before. Books on the shelves, real books well worn from reading. A chess set carved from light and dark wood, the pieces intricate representations of forest animals. Dried herbs hanging from the rafters filling the air with their subtle fragrance. On a small table near the bed she saw a silver locket tarnished with age. She picked it up carefully, opening it to reveal a tiny portrait of a woman who must have been Ethan's mother. The resemblance was there in the eyes, the set of the jaw. A beautiful woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. Margaret felt a pang of recognition. She wore a similar locket around her own neck, though she kept it hidden beneath her high-collared dress. Inside was a photograph of Richard, her late husband. For 16 years she had worn that locket every day, a tangible reminder of the love she had lost. Lately, though, she had found herself leaving it in the drawer more often than not. Not because she had forgotten Richard, but because she was tired of wearing her grief like a badge of honor. She was still holding Ethan's mother's locket when he returned stamping snow from his boots. He saw what she held and froze in the doorway. "I'm sorry," Margaret said quickly, setting the locket back on the table. "I didn't mean to pry." "It's all right," Ethan said, crossing the room. "That was my mother's, Ruby. She died 5 winters ago." "She was beautiful," Margaret said. "You have her eyes." Ethan moved closer, picking up the locket with surprising gentleness. "She used to say these mountains were in our blood, Cherokee blood, that we belonged here even when others said we didn't." "Where is your father?" Margaret asked, then immediately regretted the question when she saw pain flicker across Ethan's face. "Gone," Ethan said, his voice flat. "When I was 3 years old, he looked at me and decided I was too much of a freak to raise. A half-breed abomination, he called me. Left the next day and never came back. Mama raised me alone." Margaret felt anger rise in her chest, hot and fierce. What kind of man abandons his own child? "The kind who cares more about what people think than what's right," Ethan said. He set the locket down carefully. "But he taught me something important. He taught me what kind of father I never want to be." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Neither was quite ready to acknowledge. Margaret stood, testing her weight on her injured ankle. It hurt, but she could manage. "We should go," she said suddenly, needing to put distance between herself and the feelings stirring in her chest. "The town will be worried." The ride back to Pine Hollow took 2 hours. Ethan led his massive draft horse through the snowdrifts while Margaret rode in the saddle. He had insisted she take it, saying his legs were built for walking. They spoke little during the journey, but the silence was comfortable, almost intimate. When they reached the edge of town, Ethan stopped. "I'll leave you here," he said. "People will talk less if you ride in alone." Margaret wanted to protest, to tell him that she did not care what people thought. But she did care. She was the school teacher, a role model for the children. Her reputation mattered not for her own sake, but for theirs. "Thank you, Mr. Blackwood," she said, "for everything." "Ethan," he said. "My name is Ethan." "Then you must call me Margaret." He helped her down from the horse, his hands spanning her waist easily. For a moment they stood close, his warmth radiating through their winter clothes. Margaret looked up at him, seeing not the giant that frightened children, but the gentle man who had saved her life and asked nothing in return. "Goodbye, Margaret. Goodbye, Ethan." She rode into town alone, acutely aware of his absence beside her. 3 weeks passed. 3 weeks during which Margaret threw herself into teaching with renewed vigor, trying not to think about the night she had spent in Ethan Blackwood's cabin, trying not to remember the way his hands had been so gentle when binding her ankle, trying not to hear his deep voice saying her name in that careful way as if her name was something precious. But her body would not let her forget. It started with morning sickness, a queasy feeling that sent her running for the chamber pot before breakfast. Then came the exhaustion, bone-deep weariness that no amount of rest seemed to cure. She attributed it to the ordeal of the storm, to stress to anything but the truth she was desperately trying to avoid. It was Martha Collins who finally forced her to face reality. "Margaret Hayes, you sit yourself down this instant," Martha commanded one afternoon, finding Margaret swaying slightly as she tried to organize supplies in the back room of the schoolhouse. Margaret sank into the nearest chair, grateful to be off her feet. "When was your last monthly course?" Martha asked bluntly. The question hit Margaret like a physical blow. Her mind raced backward through recent weeks. The storm had been October 28th. It was now late November, nearly December. And she had not bled since early October, before the storm, before that night in Ethan's cabin. "That's impossible," Margaret whispered. "I'm 43 years old, Martha. Women my age don't just become pregnant." Martha's expression was knowing and not unsympathetic. "My own sister had her last baby at 45. Honey, nature doesn't always follow our expectations, and from the look of you, I'd say you're about 6 weeks along." Margaret felt the world tilt around her. Pregnant. At her age. Unmarried. After one night of weakness with a man she barely knew. A man the entire town would assume had taken advantage of the respectable schoolteacher. Her reputation would be ruined. She would lose her position, her home, everything she had built for herself in 8 years of careful, proper living. "What am I going to do?" Margaret whispered, pressing her hands to her face. "First thing is to be certain," Martha said practically. "Then you need to tell the father." She paused, her knowing eyes studying Margaret's face. "I assume it's Ethan Blackwood?" Margaret's head snapped up. "How did you know?" Martha smiled sadly. "Darling, half the town saw him carry you in from that storm. And I have eyes. I saw the way you looked at each other when he brought you back, like two people who had found something unexpected." Margaret pressed her hands to her flat belly, trying to feel any sign of the life supposedly growing there. "I can't trap him into a marriage he doesn't want. He's been alone his whole life, rejected by everyone. I won't be another person who uses him." "Then you need to tell him the truth and let him make his own choice," Martha said firmly. "But Margaret, that man has been waiting his whole life for someone to choose him. Don't make that decision for him." 2 days later, Margaret rode out to Ethan's cabin. The journey took longer than she remembered, and by the time she arrived, her back was aching and her stomach was rolling with nerves that had nothing to do with morning sickness. She found him in the barn behind the cabin repairing a saddle. His large hands worked the leather with practiced skill, the same careful precision she had seen when he carved wood. "Margaret," he said, straightening when he saw her. His face lit up with genuine pleasure that made her heart ache. "I thought you might not want to see me again." She dismounted carefully, her movements cautious. "I need to tell you something, and you need to listen without interrupting." Ethan set down his tools, giving her his full attention. "All right." Margaret took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "I'm with child. Your child. I'm 43 years old, and this should not be possible, but it is. I didn't come here to trap you or demand anything. You deserve to know. That's all." The silence stretched between them, broken only by the sound of horses shifting in their stalls. Ethan's expression had gone completely blank, his dark eyes unreadable. Margaret found herself holding her breath, waiting for condemnation or rejection or angry accusations about her motives. Instead, he sank slowly onto a hay bale, his massive frame suddenly looking somehow diminished. "Are you certain?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yes." Martha Collins helped me confirm it. There's no doubt. Ethan stared at the barn floor for a long moment, his hands clasped between his knees. Margaret felt her heart breaking a little more with each second of silence. She had known this was a risk, that he might see the pregnancy as an attempt to trap him to force marriage with a woman he had barely looked at before that storm-bound night. When he finally looked up, his eyes held a complexity of emotions she could not entirely read. Pain, fear, hope, determination. "What do you want from me, Margaret?" he asked. "What do you expect me to do?" The question hurt more than she had anticipated. "I don't want anything from you. I thought you had a right to know, that's all. I can manage on my own. I've been doing it for years." "That's not what I meant." Ethan stood, taking a step toward her. "Margaret, I need to know what you want, whether you want this child, whether you would consider marriage." "For the child's sake." Margaret said the words bitter on her tongue. She had her answer now. He was offering marriage as a duty, a responsibility, not because he had any real feelings for her. "I appreciate the offer," she said stiffly, "but I won't trap you into a marriage you don't want. The child and I will manage perfectly well without you feeling obligated." "Stop." Ethan's voice was sharp enough to make her look at him in surprise. "Just stop talking about trapping and managing and doing things alone. That's not what I meant." He ran his hands through his hair, clearly struggling to find the right words. "Margaret, I've been alone my whole life. I never thought I'd have a family. Never thought any woman would want to build a life with someone like me." He gestured at himself, his voice dropping. "Look at me, Margaret. 8 feet tall, hands that can snap wood like kindling. Most women see a monster, not a husband." He took another step closer, his eyes intense. "But this child, our child, deserves better than growing up without a father. I know what that's like, and I won't let it happen to my son or daughter." Margaret felt tears pricking at her eyes, though whether from disappointment or relief she could not say. "So, you're proposing marriage out of duty?" "I'm proposing marriage because it's the right thing to do," Ethan said, his voice firm now, certain. "For all of us. We're both adults, Margaret. We both know this situation isn't ideal, but we can make the best of it. I'll be a good husband to you and a good father to the child. I promise you that." It was not the romantic proposal she had once dreamed of back when she was young and Richard Hayes was courting her in Boston. But it was honest. It was practical. It offered security for both her and the baby. Margaret found herself nodding before she had fully processed the decision. "All right," she said, "for the child's sake." Neither of them mentioned love, though both were thinking about it. Margaret with regret for what this arrangement lacked. Ethan with hope that perhaps given time duty might grow into something deeper. The wedding took place 1 week later, on November 15th, 1884. It was held in the small wooden church at the center of Pine Hollow, with only a handful of witnesses present. Margaret had wanted something small and understated, partly to avoid drawing attention to the rushed timeline, but mostly because elaborate celebrations felt inappropriate for what was essentially a business arrangement. The wedding dress had belonged to Ethan's mother, carefully preserved in tissue paper and cedar chips for over 30 years. When Ruby Blackwood had married Ethan's father in 1850, the cream-colored silk had been the finest thing she had ever owned. Now, as Margaret stood before the mirror in the back room of the church, adjusting the fitted bodice that had required only minor alterations, she felt the weight of history and hope that the dress carried. "You look beautiful, dear," said Mrs. Patterson, the pastor's wife, as she made final adjustments to the simple veil. Ethan's mother would be so pleased to see her dress worn again, especially for such a joyous occasion. Margaret nodded, though joy was not exactly what she was feeling. Nervous anticipation, certainly. Relief that she and the baby would have security and respectability. Even a cautious optimism about building a life with a man she was beginning to understand and respect. But joy seemed too strong a word for a marriage born of necessity rather than love. Ethan stood at the altar looking uncomfortable in his best suit. The jacket strained across his massive shoulders, and even the church's high ceiling seemed inadequate for his frame. But when Margaret walked down the aisle, something in his expression shifted. The careful formality in his dark eyes gave way to something warmer, more genuine. "You look," he began when she reached his side, then stopped apparently at a loss for words. "The dress fits well," Margaret replied practically, though she was blushing slightly at the admiration in his voice. Reverend Thomas Bradford cleared his throat and began the traditional words, speaking of love and honor and commitment until death parted them. When they reached the vows, both Margaret and Ethan spoke their promises with quiet sincerity, though neither met the other's eyes. "You may kiss the bride," the pastor announced. For the first time, Margaret felt a flutter of real nervousness. They had not kissed since that night during the storm, had not touched beyond the occasional brush of fingers when he helped her from a wagon or handed her something across a table. Ethan's hands were gentle as they framed her face, his touch as careful as if she were made of the same delicate wood he carved into animals. When his lips met hers, the kiss was soft and respectful, lasting only a moment before he drew back. But it was enough to remind Margaret of the tenderness she had glimpsed that stormy night. Enough to make her wonder if perhaps this arrangement might become something more than mere convenience. The reception was held at the boarding house where Mrs. Jenkins had prepared a simple meal for the small gathering. Margaret found herself studying her new husband as he accepted congratulations and best wishes from their neighbors. There was an awkwardness about him in social situations, a careful formality that suggested he was never quite comfortable being the center of attention. Samuel Owen, the elderly neighbor, who had been friends with Ethan's mother, clapped the younger man on the shoulder with surprising strength for his 68 years. "Never thought I'd see the day, boy," Samuel said, his weathered face creasing into a smile. "Your mama would be proud." When they finally returned to the cabin, to what was now their shared home, the weight of their new reality settled between them like a physical presence. Margaret carried her small valise of belongings, looking around the main room with fresh eyes, now that this was to be her permanent residence. "I've cleared space in the bedroom," Ethan said, his voice carefully neutral. "The dresser and half the wardrobe are yours now. I can sleep in the barn if you'd prefer privacy while you're carrying." "That's not necessary," Margaret replied, though the thought of sharing a bed with this man she barely knew sent her pulse racing for reasons she did not want to examine too closely. "We're married now. Married couples share bedrooms." That night, as they lay in the darkness on opposite sides of the bed, a careful distance between them, both wondered if duty would ever become something more. Outside, the first snow of winter began to fall, covering the mountains in white silence. 300 miles away in Cedar Ridge, the largest town in this part of West Virginia, a very different conversation was taking place. Victor Sterling stood in his office at Sterling Coal Company headquarters, studying a map spread across his mahogany desk. He was 55 years old, tall and lean with cold gray eyes, and the kind of distinguished looks that made people trust him. It was a trust he had spent 30 years exploiting for profit. On the map before him, one parcel of land was circled in red ink. It sat high in the mountains above Pine Hollow, encompassing Ethan Blackwood's cabin and the surrounding forest. Beside the circle in Sterling's neat handwriting were the words, "Richest coal vein in West Virginia. Estimated value, $2 million. Deputy Frank Morrison stood on the other side of the desk, hat in hand, waiting for instructions. Morrison was 38, broad-shouldered, with the look of a man who enjoyed using his authority to push people around. "The half-breed refused your offer," Morrison reported, his voice flat. Sterling's thin lips compressed into a line. "I sent an agent last month, offered $500 for land worth $2 million. The ignorant savage turned it down flat, said the land wasn't for sale at any price." "So what do we do, sir?" Sterling looked up from the map, his eyes calculating. "We make him disappear. Or better yet, we make him a criminal. Plant evidence. I want that land by spring when we start the new mining operation." "What kind of evidence?" "Timber theft from federal land," Sterling said, pulling out a leather-bound ledger. "The penalty is 5 years in federal prison, Plenty of time for us to claim the property for unpaid taxes and back fees. By the time he gets out, if he gets out, that land will be ours." Morrison shifted uncomfortably. "There are folks in Pine Hollow who know Blackwood. They might not believe he's a thief." "Then we make them believe it," Sterling said, flipping through pages of names and numbers. "We've done this before, Deputy, 6 times in the last 3 years. Not one of those families still owns their land." "When do we start?" "Tonight." Sterling said, his voice cold as winter ice. "While he's distracted. I hear there's a woman at his cabin now, a wife, even better. When we arrest him, she'll be left alone and helpless. Easier to pressure her into selling." Morrison nodded, putting on his hat. "I'll need 3 men and 20 red oak logs from the Federal Reserve." "Take what you need," Sterling said. "Just make sure the evidence is solid. I want this done right." After Morrison left, Sterling returned to his map, running his finger along the proposed route for the new rail line that would carry coal from the mountains to the cities back east. Everything was coming together perfectly. The land acquisition, the political connections, the carefully placed bribes that ensured cooperation from local law enforcement. Ethan Blackwood was just another obstacle to be removed. Sterling had removed dozens before him. One more half-breed mountain man would make no difference to anyone. But Victor Sterling had made one critical mistake. He had underestimated the quiet schoolteacher who had just become Ethan Blackwood's wife. He did not know that Margaret Hayes had spent 15 years teaching children how to think logically, how to research thoroughly, and how to stand up for what was right even when the world told them to sit down. The war for their family had begun. But neither Sterling nor Ethan yet understood that the most dangerous person in the room was often the one everyone underestimated. The first 2 weeks of their marriage settled into an awkward rhythm that neither Ethan nor Margaret quite knew how to break. Each morning, Ethan rose before dawn to tend his trap lines and check his small herd of goats, allowing Margaret privacy to dress and prepare breakfast. She cooked and cleaned with the same efficient competence she brought to teaching, treating the domestic tasks as responsibilities requiring skill and attention to detail. In the evenings they sat by the fire reading, Margaret with her books of poetry and literature that she had brought from her old life, Ethan with farming journals and the worn Bible his mother had left him. Occasionally one would comment on something interesting, leading to careful conversations that revealed more about their personalities and values than either intended. They were learning each other the way one might learn a new language. Slowly, with frequent misunderstandings, but with genuine effort on both sides. It was during one of these quiet evenings, 2 weeks into their marriage, that Margaret truly watched Ethan carve for the first time. She had noticed the wooden animals scattered around the cabin before small and beautifully detailed figures that captured something essential about each creature. A bear's power, a deer's grace, an owl's wisdom. But watching him create one was entirely different. His massive hands moved with delicate precision across the piece of pine he held. The knife became an extension of his thoughts, each cut deliberate and sure. Wood shavings fell like snow around his feet as a deer slowly emerged from the raw material, taking shape under his patient guidance. Margaret set aside her book, mesmerized by the transformation. "You're very talented," she observed. "How long have you been carving?" Ethan did not look up from his work, his focus absolute. "My mother taught me when I was small. She said it would help me learn to be gentle with things, to use my hands for creating instead of just working." Margaret could see the truth of that philosophy in the way he handled the knife and the patient care he took with each detail. The deer taking shape in his hands had individual strands of fur visible along its neck muscles, defined beneath the wood grain that suggested movement frozen in time. "What made you choose animals?" she asked. "They were the first ones that weren't afraid of me," Ethan said simply. "When I was a boy, some of the kids in town used to dare each other to get close to the giant. Made me feel like a monster sometimes. But animals, they don't care how big you are if you're gentle with them." The confession was quietly offered without self-pity, but it gave Margaret new insight into the man she had married. She could imagine him as a child, already towering over his peers, trying to find his place in a world that saw him as a curiosity rather than a person. "Children can be cruel," she said softly. "I've seen it in my classroom the way they sometimes treat anyone who's different." Ethan glanced up from his carving, meeting her eyes. "Did you ever feel different?" Margaret considered the question seriously. "Always. Too bookish for most of the girls my age. Too interested in ideas instead of gossip. Even in my marriage to Richard, I sometimes felt like I was playing a role that didn't quite fit." "And now?" Ethan asked the question weighted with implications about their current arrangement. Margaret met his gaze steadily, seeing something vulnerable in his dark eyes that encouraged honesty. "Now I feel like perhaps being different isn't such a terrible thing. Perhaps it just means I needed to find someone who understood what it was like." Something shifted in Ethan's expression, a subtle warming that made Margaret's heart skip. For a moment, the careful formality between them cracked, revealing the possibility of something deeper. He set down his carving and crossed to where she sat, kneeling beside her chair so their eyes were level. "I never thought I'd have a wife," he said quietly, his voice rough with emotion. "Never thought any woman would want to share a life with someone like me." "And I never thought I would marry again," Margaret replied, reaching out to touch his face without thinking. Her hand looked impossibly small against his bearded cheek. "Especially not under these circumstances." Ethan leaned into her touch, his eyes closing briefly. "But you know what, Margaret, I'm not sorry. Are you—" She thought about her answer carefully, about the life she had been living before that storm. Safe, predictable, empty in ways she had not let herself acknowledge. "No," she said finally. "I'm not sorry either." He smiled, then a genuine smile that transformed his stern features into something almost beautiful, and placed his large hand over hers where it rested against his face. They sat that way for several minutes, hands linked, fire crackling, the first real bridge built between duty and something that might eventually become love. But in the darkness beyond their warm cabin, betrayal was already in motion. Forces they knew nothing about were moving against them, setting into play events that would test everything they were building together. Jacob Winters had been a lumberjack for 20 years, working the forests of West Virginia with skill and pride. He was 35 years old, married with 2 small children, and desperately in debt. The mine where his brother worked had collapsed last spring, killing James and leaving behind a widow and 4 orphaned children. Jacob had taken them in without hesitation because that was what family did. But now he had 6 mouths to feed on a lumberjack's wages, and winter was coming hard. His wife Sarah had started coughing at night, that deep, wet cough that spoke of pneumonia if they could not afford to keep the house warm. His oldest nephew needed shoes. His daughter had outgrown her winter coat. The debts mounted faster than he could pay them. When Deputy Frank Morrison approached him in the Pine Hollow Saloon one cold November evening, offering $100 for an evening's work with no questions asked, Jacob's conscience warred with his desperation. $100 was more than he made in 2 months of hard labor. It would clear his debts, buy medicine for Sarah, put food on the table through the winter. "What do you need me to do?" Jacob asked, his voice low. Morrison leaned closer, his breath smelling of whiskey and tobacco. "Move some timber from one location to another. 20 logs. Just need strong backs and closed mouths." "What kind of timber?" "The kind that pays $100, Morrison said flatly. "You interested or not?" Jacob thought of Sarah's cough, of his daughter's threadbare coat, of the children who depended on him. He thought of the honor his brother had taught him, of the man he wanted to be. But hunger and fear won out over principle, as they so often did for desperate men. "I'm interested," he said, hating himself even as the words left his mouth. 3 nights later, on November 25th, Jacob found himself working in the darkness with Morrison and 3 other men. They were loading 20 massive red oak logs onto wagons, each one clearly marked with federal property stamps. Jacob realized too late what he had agreed to. They were stealing timber from protected forest land. "Where are we taking these?" Jacob asked, his conscience finally asserting itself. Morrison looked at him with cold eyes that held no mercy. Blackwood's property, the half-breed up the mountain. Jacob knew Ethan Blackwood by reputation, knew he was an honest man who kept to himself and never caused trouble. Why are we putting stolen timber on his land? Because Victor Sterling wants his property and this is how we're going to get it, Morrison said bluntly. You have a problem with that, Winters. Jacob thought of his children again, of the $100 already promised. No problem, he said, hating himself more with each word. They finished the work in 3 hours, stacking the stolen logs in Ethan's storage shed while he was in town purchasing winter supplies with his new wife. Morrison paid Jacob the promised $100 in cash, then gripped his shoulder hard enough to hurt. You speak one word of this to anyone, and your whole family will pay. Morrison said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. Understand. Jacob nodded, pocketing the money that suddenly felt like 30 pieces of silver burning against his chest. He went home to his family, unable to meet his wife's eyes when she asked if he had found extra work. The money would feed them through winter, but it had cost him something he could never get back. 2 days later, on November 28th, Deputy Morrison and 3 armed men rode up to Ethan Blackwood's cabin. Margaret was inside preparing lunch now, 12 weeks pregnant, though not yet showing significantly. She heard the horses and looked out the window, recognizing Morrison from his occasional visits to town. Something in the way the men carried themselves and the rifles strapped to their saddles made her stomach clench with instinctive fear. Ethan emerged from the barn where he had been splitting wood. He saw the men and stopped, his body language shifting to something more alert, more wary. Margaret watched him assess the situation, saw the moment he understood this was not a social call. Ethan Blackwood, Morrison called out, his voice carrying false authority. You're under arrest for timber theft from federal land. Margaret felt the world tilt. She moved to the door, opening it, despite Ethan's warning gesture for her to stay inside. There must be some mistake, Ethan said, his voice calm but firm. I've never stolen timber. I have proper permits for all the wood I cut. Morrison swung down from his horse, pulling out a pair of iron shackles. We already checked your storage shed. 20 red oak logs, each one marked with federal property stamps. That's $500 worth of timber Blackwood. That's 5 years in federal prison. I don't know what you're talking about, Ethan said, his hands spreading in a gesture of innocence. Those logs weren't there yesterday when I was working in that shed. Morrison's smile was cruel and knowing. Sure they weren't. Margaret rushed off the porch, ignoring the pain in her still healing ankle. This is a lie. My husband is an honest man. He would never steal so much as a chicken, let alone federal timber. Ma'am, you need to step back, Morrison warned. This is official business. Official business. Margaret's voice rose with indignation. This is a setup. Anyone with half a brain can see that. Who's paying you to frame my husband, Deputy Morrison? Morrison's face darkened with anger. Careful, lady. Accusations like that can get you in trouble, too. Margaret, Ethan said quietly, but his wife was not listening. Go ahead and arrest me then, she challenged. Arrest us both for speaking the truth. This is corruption, and everyone in Pine Hollow will know it. Ethan moved between Margaret and the armed men, his massive body a shield. Margaret, go back inside. I won't, she said, trying to move around him. They can arrest me, and they will at least until this gets sorted out in court, Ethan said. His voice resigned but not defeated. His whole life had taught him that the world was not fair to people like him. Margaret saw the defeat in his eyes and felt something fierce awaken in her chest. Then we'll prove your innocence in court. We'll show everyone this is a lie. Ethan looked at her, seeing the determination in her face, and felt something shift in his chest. This woman, his wife of barely 2 weeks, was ready to fight for him, ready to stand against corruption and power on his behalf. Morrison snapped the shackles on Ethan's wrists. The iron barely fit around his thick bones, designed for normal-sized men. You'll have a hearing in Cedar Ridge in 3 weeks. Judge Victor Morgan presides. Until then, you're held in Pine Hollow Jail. 3 weeks. Margaret felt panic rising. You can't keep him locked up for 3 weeks without a trial. Federal crime, ma'am, Morrison said with false politeness. That's the law. They loaded Ethan onto a wagon-like cargo, his massive frame making the vehicle creak under his weight. He looked back at Margaret standing on their porch, one hand protectively over her belly, where their child grew invisible but present. "Take care of yourself," he called to her. "Take care of our baby." Margaret's hands clenched into fists at her sides. "I'll take care of all of us," she called back, and there was steel in her voice that made even Morrison glance at her twice. "I promise you, Ethan Blackwood, I will bring you home." After they were gone, Margaret stood alone in the sudden silence. Around her, the mountains rose like sentinels, indifferent to human drama. Snow began to fall again, soft and quiet, covering everything in white. She placed both hands on her belly, feeling the faint flutter that might have been the baby or might have been her own fear. "They have no idea who they're dealing with," she whispered to the child growing inside her. "No idea at all." The next morning Margaret rode into Pine Hollow and went directly to the home of Samuel Owen, the elderly neighbor who had been at their wedding. Samuel was 68 years old, weathered by 7 decades of mountain living, with eyes that missed nothing. "Samuel, I need your help," Margaret said without preamble when he opened his door. "They arrested Ethan for stealing federal timber. It's a lie. This is corruption, and I need to know everything you can tell me about it." Samuel's weathered face darkened with anger. "That boy never stole nothing in his life. Come inside, Margaret. This smells like sterling coal, and if it is, you need to know what you're up against." Over the next hour, sitting at Samuel's rough-hewn kitchen table, Margaret learned about a pattern of systematic destruction that made her blood run cold. Sterling Coal Company had been expanding their operations throughout West Virginia for a decade, Samuel explained. Wherever Victor Sterling wanted land, mysterious crimes would occur: timber theft, cattle rustling, vandalism. The landowners would be arrested or financially ruined. Within months, Sterling would swoop in and buy the property for a fraction of its value. 6 families in the last 3 years, Samuel said, ticking them off on his gnarled fingers. The Johnsons lost their farm to cattle rustling charges. The Martins were accused of vandalism. The Chens, they were Chinese immigrants. Suddenly their papers weren't good enough after 20 years. The O'Briens, the Washingtons, the Kowalskis. Every single one ended up losing their land to Sterling. And you know what they all had in common? What, Margaret asked, though she was beginning to understand. Coal. Every single property turned out to have valuable coal deposits. Geological surveys would go out, find the coal, and within months the family would be destroyed, and Sterling would own the land. Margaret felt the pieces clicking into place in her mind, forming a picture of calculated evil that was both simple and monstrous. This isn't personal. This is business. Ethan's land must have something Sterling wants badly enough to break the law. "More than badly enough," Samuel said. "I heard through the grapevine that they found the richest coal vein in West Virginia running under Ethan's property. Worth millions, they say. Enough to make a man do terrible things." Margaret pulled out a notebook from her bag, the same one she used for lesson planning. She began writing, creating lists and timelines with the methodical precision of a teacher organizing a complex lesson. "I need to see property records," she said. "I need to talk to those families you mentioned. I need to understand the pattern so I can prove it's deliberate." Samuel leaned back in his chair, studying her with new respect. "That's dangerous work, Margaret. Sterling has judges and lawmen in his pocket. You go poking around, you might find yourself in trouble too." Margaret looked up from her notebook, and Samuel saw something in her eyes that reminded him of Ethan's mother, Ruby Blackwood. That same fierce determination, that refusal to back down in the face of injustice. "Let him try to stop me," Margaret said quietly. "I've been underestimated my whole life, Samuel. It's time to make that work in my favor." Over the next week, Margaret conducted an investigation that would have done any detective proud. She rode to Cedar Ridge, the county seat, and spent hours in the courthouse examining land records. She documented every property Sterling had acquired in the past 5 years, noting the dates, the circumstances, the patterns. She visited the families Samuel had mentioned, listening to their stories of harassment and false accusations. Anna Brennan, who had been Anna Chin before her family's destruction forced them to change their name, told Margaret about immigration charges that appeared 20 years after her family had been legally documented. "They want to overwhelm you," Anna explained in careful English, her accent still thick despite years in America. "They attack from many sides at once. Make you so tired, so scared, you just give up. Easier to leave than fight." Margaret wrote everything down, creating timelines that showed the identical pattern repeating across 6 different families: geological survey, crime accusation, arrest, or financial pressure. Property sale to Sterling within 6 months. She found the surveyor who had mapped Ethan's property and, with a combination of charm and subtle pressure, got him to confirm what Samuel had said. Massive coal deposits, estimated value in the millions. A proposed rail line that would run directly through Ethan's land, making it invaluable for transportation as well as mining. But finding evidence of a pattern and proving Sterling had deliberately orchestrated it were 2 different things. Margaret needed something concrete, something that directly connected Sterling to the frame-up of her husband. It was Martha Collins who provided the crucial lead. She found Margaret one evening at the boarding house where Margaret had taken a room to be closer to town during her investigation. "I was at the Mercantile yesterday," Martha said, closing the door behind her. "I saw Jacob Winters buying supplies. New boots for his whole family. A ham, sugar, coffee. Things a lumberjack with 6 children can't usually afford. When I asked how business was going, he looked guilty as sin and practically ran out of the store." Margaret's pen paused over her notebook. "Jacob Winters. He does lumbering work, doesn't he?" "Has for 20 years, Martha confirmed. "Honest as they come, usually. But he's been struggling something terrible since his brother died and he took in the widow and her children. 6 mouths to feed on one man's wages." Margaret felt a chill of understanding. "If you were desperate enough and someone offered you money to do something questionable, would you take it?" Martha's eyes widened. "You think Jacob helped plant that timber?" "I think someone paid him to move it," Margaret said, "and I think his conscience is eating him alive." Finding Jacob Winters proved easier than Margaret expected. He was working a stand of trees 5 miles outside Pine Hollow, the rhythmic sound of his axe echoing through the forest. When he saw Margaret approaching on horseback, his face went pale. "Mrs. Blackwood," he said, setting down his axe, "I heard about Ethan. Terrible thing." Margaret dismounted, studying the younger man carefully. She had taught for long enough to recognize guilt when she saw it. It was written in every line of his body in the way he could not quite meet her eyes. "Jacob, I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I want you to think very carefully before you answer," she said, her voice calm but implacable. "Your soul may depend on it." Jacob's hands tightened on his axe handle. "Ma'am, did Deputy Morrison pay you to move federal timber onto my husband's property?" The silence stretched between them, broken only by the wind in the trees and the distant call of a crow. Jacob's face worked through a dozen expressions, guilt and fear and shame chasing each other across his weathered features. Finally he set down his axe and sank onto a fallen log, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "I have 6 children to feed," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "My own 2 and my brother's 4. Morrison offered me $100. That's more money than I make in 2 months. I knew it was wrong. I did it anyway because my wife is sick and my daughter needs a winter coat and I was desperate." Margaret felt anger and pity warring in her chest. "So you let an innocent man take the blame for your crime." Jacob's head dropped into his hands. "I know what I did was wrong. I haven't slept right since. Every time I close my eyes I see his face. But Morrison said if I confess he'd hurt my family, my children, Mrs. Blackwood. What was I supposed to do?" "You're supposed to do what's right," Margaret said, but her voice had softened slightly. She understood desperation. She understood the terrible choices poverty forced on good people. "And what's right is helping me save my husband from going to prison for something he didn't do." Jacob looked up, hope and fear mingling in his eyes. "If I testify, Morrison will kill my family." "If you testify, I can protect you," Margaret said. There's a federal marshal named Samuel Cooper investigating corruption in this region. He can offer you protection in exchange for testimony. But more than that, Jacob, this isn't just about one case. Sterling has destroyed 6 families that I know of. How many more will he destroy if good men stay silent out of fear?" Jacob was quiet for a long moment, wrestling with his conscience and his terror. The wind moved through the trees, carrying the scent of coming snow. Finally he nodded. "I'll do it," he said. "God help me, I'll testify. But Mrs. Blackwood, you need to understand something. Sterling doesn't just have Morrison working for him. He has judges, politicians, businessmen. He's connected all the way to Charleston. Taking him down won't be easy." "Then we'll have to be smarter than all of them," Margaret said, standing and brushing bark from her skirt. "Can you meet me at Reverend Bradford's house tomorrow evening? Bring any paperwork Morrison gave you? Any receipts or notes?" "I'll be there," Jacob promised. As Margaret rode back toward town, she felt the first real stirrings of hope. She had evidence. She had a witness. Now she needed allies and a plan. But Margaret did not yet know that Victor Sterling had already anticipated her investigation. Even now, a letter was making its way from Boston to Pine Hollow, carrying a threat that would attack her from an entirely different direction and prove that her enemies were more dangerous and better connected than she had imagined. The letter arrived on a cold December morning, delivered by a well-dressed courier who seemed oddly nervous for someone carrying what appeared to be simple correspondence. Margaret accepted the expensive envelope with growing unease, noting the Boston postmark and the unfamiliar law firm embossed on the return address. She waited until the courier had departed before opening it, some instinct warning her that the contents would not be pleasant. She was right. The letterhead read, "Hayes and Whitmore Attorneys at Law," and the contents made Margaret's blood run cold. "Dear Mrs. Hayes." It began pointedly, using her maiden name and ignoring her marriage to Ethan. "We represent the estate of the late Richard Hayes and his surviving family members. It has come to our attention that you are currently expecting a child conceived out of wedlock." Margaret's hands began to tremble as she read on. "As the deceased's family holds legitimate interest in any potential Hayes heirs, we hereby demand immediate custody of said child upon birth. Furthermore, should you resist this reasonable request, we are prepared to expose your immoral conduct to the territorial authorities and pursue full legal action. The Hayes family cannot allow their good name to be tarnished by association with illegitimate offspring born of scandalous circumstances." The letter concluded with an ultimatum. She had 7 days to respond to this demand and make arrangements for the transfer of custody. Failure to comply would result in immediate legal action. It was signed by Cornelius Hayes, Esquire, Richard's older brother. Margaret sank into the nearest chair, the letter trembling in her hands. She had met Cornelius only once at Richard's funeral 15 years ago. He had been cold and dismissive, then barely acknowledging her presence. The Hayes family had never approved of Richard's marriage to a woman they considered beneath their social station. But this was monstrous. The Hayes family was one of Boston's oldest and wealthiest. They had resources and connections that stretched across the country. And somehow they had learned about her pregnancy, but appeared to have no knowledge of her marriage to Ethan. The timing was too perfect to be coincidence. Someone had deliberately fed them incomplete information, setting up a legal attack designed to destroy her while Ethan sat helpless in jail. The realization hit her like a physical blow. This was not just about stealing land. This was a coordinated assault meant to dismantle her family from every angle, frame Ethan for a crime he did not commit. While Margaret investigated that attack, her with a second legal battle designed to take her child. 2 fronts. Sterling was attacking them on 2 fronts. Martha Collins arrived within the hour, having seen the courier in town and sensing trouble. She found Margaret sitting at the kitchen table, the letter spread before her, her face pale, but her eyes blazing with determination. "What's happened?" Martha asked, pouring tea without being asked. Margaret handed her the letter. Martha read it quickly, her expression growing increasingly outraged with each line. "This is monstrous," Martha said when she finished. They're claiming rights to a child that isn't even theirs, and they're calling you immoral when you're legally married." "They don't know I'm married," Margaret said quietly. "Someone made sure of that. Someone who wants me distracted, threatened, and unable to focus on clearing Ethan's name." "Sterling," Martha said with certainty. "It has to be. This is too coordinated to be coincidence. He frames Ethan for timber theft. While you're investigating that, he feeds false information to the Hayes family to create a second legal battle." Margaret pressed her hands flat on the table, forcing herself to think clearly past the fear and rage. "Then we fight on two fronts. I'm not alone in this. The whole community is behind us." But even as Martha spoke words of encouragement, Margaret felt the weight of what she was facing pressing down on her shoulders. She was nearly 4 months pregnant now, though not yet showing significantly. Her husband was in jail, and now she had to prepare for a legal battle with one of Boston's most powerful families. The odds seemed insurmountable. That evening, Margaret called a meeting at Reverend Bradford's house. The group had grown since her initial conversation with Samuel Owen. Along with Samuel Martha Collins and Jacob Winters, there were now 3 other families who had lost property to Sterling. A newspaper editor from Cedar Ridge named James Fletcher, who had been investigating Sterling for months. And most importantly, Federal Marshal Samuel Cooper. Marshal Cooper was 58 years old with gray hair, a face scarred by violence, and eyes that had seen too much corruption to be surprised by anything. He had been investigating Sterling coal for 6 months, following a trail of suspicious land acquisitions across 3 states. Ethan's case had caught his attention because it fit a pattern he had been documenting. Margaret presented everything she had gathered: the property records showing Sterling's systematic targeting of land with coal deposits, the timeline of arrests always involving Deputy Morrison or his associates, Jacob Winters' confession about being paid to move the timber, the geological survey confirming millions of dollars worth of coal under Ethan's property. Then she showed them the Hayes letter. "This is the same tactic Sterling used on the Chen family." Anna Brennan spoke up, her English careful but clear. "When my husband tried to fight the false charges suddenly, there were problems with our immigration papers that had been legal for 20 years. It was meant to overwhelm us, make us give up." Cooper studied the Hayes letter with a professional eye. "This is definitely coordinated. The question is, can we prove Sterling is behind both attacks?" Margaret pulled out another document, this one a telegram she had obtained from the Cedar Ridge Telegraph Office through careful questioning and a small bribe. He read it aloud. "Subject: married to widow of Richard Hayes. Child expected spring. Family may wish to pursue interests." The address matched the law firm that had sent Margaret the threatening letter. "How did you get this?" Cooper asked, impressed despite himself. "The telegraph operator is the brother of one of my former students," Margaret said. "He remembered me being kind to his sister. People talk more freely to teachers than they do to lawmen." Cooper nodded slowly. "This is good. This connects Sterling directly to the Hayes attack. But we still need more. We need Sterling's internal documents, letters, ledgers, anything proving he ordered the frame up." Margaret took a deep breath. "Then someone would have to search his office." Every eye in the room turned to her. She was a woman, and women were often dismissed as no threat at all. She was pregnant, which made her seem even more harmless, and she had a legitimate reason to be in Cedar Ridge, as the hearing for Ethan's case was scheduled there in 2 weeks. "Absolutely not," Cooper said immediately. "If you're caught, Sterling could have you arrested for trespassing or worse. You're pregnant, Mrs. Blackwood. The risk is too great." "The risk is greater if I do nothing," Margaret countered. "My husband faces 5 years in prison. My child may be taken away by people who have no right to her. I will not sit idle while my family is destroyed." She stood, one hand resting on her belly where the baby had started to show more obviously. "I'm not asking permission. I'm telling you what I'm going to do. If you want to help me plan it safely, I welcome your assistance, but I'm doing this regardless." The group exchanged glances. They saw in Margaret something that Sterling had fatally underestimated. A quiet woman pushed past her breaking point. A mother protecting her unborn child. A wife fighting for her husband's freedom. There was no force more dangerous than that. Finally, Marshal Cooper nodded slowly. "If you're determined to do this, then we do it right. We minimize the risks and maximize your chances of success." Over the next hour, they planned the operation with military precision. Margaret would travel to Cedar Ridge under the pretense of consulting with lawyers about the Hayes claim. Anna Brennan would accompany her ostensibly as a midwife concerned about the pregnancy. In reality, Anna would be the lookout and getaway driver. Samuel Owen and Jacob Winters would travel separately, ready to create diversions if needed. Marshal Cooper would position himself at the Cedar Ridge courthouse, maintaining a legitimate official presence that might deter Sterling from taking drastic action if Margaret was discovered. The key would be timing. Sterling held regular meetings every Friday afternoon, with his mine supervisors' meetings that typically lasted 3 hours. His office would be empty but unlocked as his secretary left early on Fridays. Margaret would have a window of opportunity, but it would be narrow and dangerous. "One more thing," Cooper said as the meeting broke up. "Mrs. Blackwood, if you find what we need, you get out immediately. Don't wait. Don't try to gather more. Sterling is a dangerous man. He's already shown he's willing to break laws to get what he wants. There's no telling what he would do to protect himself if cornered." Margaret nodded, but privately she knew she would take whatever risks were necessary. This was about more than just clearing Ethan's name. This was about justice for all the families Sterling had destroyed. This was about proving that ordinary people could stand up to corruption and win. The next few days passed in a blur of preparation. Margaret visited Ethan in the Pine Hollow jail every afternoon, bringing him food and what updates she could share. She could not tell him about the plan to search Sterling's office, not with guards potentially listening, but she held his hand through the bars and promised him that everything would be all right. "You shouldn't be taking risks," Ethan said during one visit, his eyes going to her rounded belly. Now at 16 weeks, the pregnancy was becoming obvious. "You're carrying our child. That's what matters most." "Our child deserves a father who's free," Margaret replied firmly. "She deserves to grow up knowing that her parents fought for what was right even when it was dangerous." Ethan reached through the bars to cup her face, his large hand gentle against her cheek. "Margaret, no matter what happens at that hearing, I need you to know something. I love you, not because you're my wife or the mother of my child, though I treasure both those things. I love you because you see me, really see me, when no one else ever has." Margaret felt tears spring to her eyes. "And I love you," she said, the words coming easier than she expected. "You taught me that love isn't something buried with the past, that it can grow wild and strong like these mountains, that it's worth fighting for, worth risking everything for." They kissed through the bars, awkward and desperate, and full of fear for what was coming. When Margaret finally left, Ethan watched her go with a mixture of pride and terror. His wife was about to walk into danger for him, and he was powerless to protect her. On the evening before she was scheduled to leave for Cedar Ridge, Margaret sat at the small desk in her boarding house room and wrote a letter to her unborn child. Her hand rested on her belly as she wrote, feeling the strong kicks and rolls of active life within her. "My dearest child," she wrote, "if you are reading this, it means something has gone wrong. It means I did not come back from trying to save your father. I want you to know that every choice I made was out of love for you and for him." She poured everything into that letter. Her hopes, her fears, her belief that some things were worth fighting for, worth risking everything for. Justice, truth, family. Not just words, but the pillars on which good lives were built. She signed it, sealed it, and left it with Reverend Bradford with instructions to give it to her child if anything happened to her. Outside, the winter stars wheeled overhead, cold and distant and indifferent to human struggles. But inside that small boarding house room, a 43-year-old schoolteacher prepared to face the greatest challenge of her life. Armed with nothing but her wits, her courage, and her unshakable determination to protect the people she loved. The battle lines had been drawn. The players were in position. And come Friday afternoon, Margaret Hayes Blackwood would walk into the lion's den and bet everything on her ability to outsmart one of the most powerful men in West Virginia. Friday afternoon arrived with deceptive calm. Margaret stood across the street from the Sterling Coal Company headquarters, her heart hammering against her ribs. The building was 3 stories of red brick, imposing and solid, a monument to wealth built on the backs of desperate families. Smoke rose from a dozen chimneys across Cedar Ridge, the coal mining town that Victor Sterling had essentially built and now controlled. The air smelled of coal dust and industrial progress, the scent of money being made, while people were being crushed beneath the wheels of that progress. Anna Brennan stood beside her, a wicker basket over her arm that supposedly contained midwife supplies. In reality, it held empty satchels for whatever documents Margaret might find. They had watched for the past hour as Sterling's mine supervisors arrived for their weekly meeting. 12 men in work clothes filing into the building's east entrance like soldiers reporting for duty. At precisely 2 o'clock, Sterling himself emerged from his office on the 2nd floor, visible through the large windows that faced the street. He was dressed impeccably, as always, his gray hair perfectly combed, moving with the confidence of a man who had never faced real consequences for his actions. He descended the interior stairs and disappeared into the conference room with his supervisors. "Now," Anna said quietly. Margaret crossed the street, forcing herself to walk normally despite the trembling in her legs. At 16 weeks pregnant, her belly was starting to show beneath her traveling dress. She looked like what she was, a respectable pregnant woman conducting business. Nothing threatening, nothing worth noticing. The building's main entrance was unlocked during business hours. Margaret climbed the stairs to the 2nd floor, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpet Sterling had installed to demonstrate his wealth. His office door bore his name in gold lettering. She tried the handle, unlocked just as Jacob had said it would be. Margaret slipped inside and closed the door behind her, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might be audible. Sterling's office was exactly what she expected. Mahogany desk polished to a mirror shine, leather chairs, maps of West Virginia covering one wall marked with circles and notations. Filing cabinets lined another wall. She moved to the desk first, scanning the papers with practiced efficiency. Bills of sale, mining reports, correspondence about equipment and labor. Nothing incriminating on the surface, all perfectly legitimate business. She opened the desk drawers systematically, her hands steady despite her racing pulse. The first 2 drawers held more of the same. Routine business documents. The 3rd drawer held a leather-bound ledger. Margaret opened it, and her breath caught in her throat. Page after page of transactions, names and amounts in neat columns. She recognized several names immediately. Deputy Frank Morrison, $500 dated 2 weeks before Ethan's arrest. Judge William Cartwright, $1,000 dated last month. Sheriff Thomas Morrison, $250 monthly. It was a record of bribes meticulously documented. Sterling's arrogance had made him careless. He had written down everything, perhaps needing the records for his own accounting, never imagining someone would dare search his private office. Margaret heard footsteps in the hallway and froze her hand still on the ledger. The steps passed by, growing fainter. She released a breath she had not known she was holding and turned to the filing cabinets. The first cabinet held geological surveys. She found Ethan's property easily. The folder was thick with documentation. Estimated coal deposits, $2.3 million worth. Proposed rail line running directly through his land. Letters discussing acquisition strategy. The second cabinet was locked. Margaret studied it for a moment, then remembered the letter opener on Sterling's desk. The lock was simple, designed more for privacy than security. She worked the blade into the mechanism, wiggling it carefully. Something clicked and the drawer slid open. Inside were letters, dozens of them. Correspondence between Sterling and various parties. Margaret rifled through them quickly, pulling out anything that looked relevant. A letter to Judge Cartwright discussing the need to expedite Ethan's hearing before too many questions could be asked. A telegram to the Hayes lawyers in Boston, the very one she had seen before, but now with Sterling's response still attached. Then she found it. A letter from Sterling to Deputy Morrison dated 3 weeks earlier, with instructions so explicit they left no room for interpretation. Arrange for the planting of 20 red oak logs marked with federal property stamps on the Blackwood property. Timing must coincide with the half-breed's absence. Ensure witnesses can testify to discovery. Payment of $500 upon completion and arrest. It was signed in Sterling's own hand with his company's seal at the bottom. Margaret felt triumph surge through her. This was it. This was the evidence that could not be explained away or dismissed. Sterling had written his own confession. She was carefully folding the letter when she heard voices growing louder in the hallway. Not passing by this time, coming closer. The meeting had ended early. Margaret stuffed the letter and ledger into her satchel, her movements suddenly frantic. She moved toward the door, then heard the handle turning. There was no time to escape. She pressed herself against the wall behind the door as it swung open, her heart threatening to burst from her chest. Victor Sterling entered, still talking to someone in the hallway. "Just let me get those contracts and I'll meet you downstairs." He moved toward his desk, and Margaret knew she had seconds before he turned and saw her. The baby kicked hard as if sensing the danger, and Margaret made a split-second decision. She stepped out from behind the door. "Mr. Sterling." Sterling spun around, his face cycling through surprise recognition and cold fury in rapid succession. "Mrs. Blackwood, what an unexpected visit." His eyes went to the satchel in her hands, and understanding dawned. "You've been going through my private documents." "I was just leaving," Margaret said, moving toward the door. Sterling moved to block her path, and for the first time Margaret felt real fear. He was bigger than her, stronger, and they were alone. "I don't think so. Your half-breed husband will rot in prison and your bastard child will be taken away, and there's nothing a schoolteacher can do about it." Margaret lifted her chin, meeting his eyes. "Watch me." She bolted for the door, hampered by her pregnancy and her still healing ankle. Sterling lunged for her, his hand catching her sleeve. Margaret twisted away, fabric tearing. She made it into the hallway and ran for the stairs, half running, half falling down the steps. Behind her, Sterling was shouting, "Stop her! Somebody stop that woman!" Margaret hit the main floor and burst through the front door into the winter afternoon. Anna was there with the buggy already moving. Margaret threw herself onto the seat, clutching the satchel to her chest like a lifeline. "Go!" she gasped. Anna snapped the reins and the horse leaped forward. Behind them, Sterling emerged from the building with 4 of his men. They ran for horses tied nearby, mounting quickly. "They're coming after us," Anna said, her voice tight with fear. The buggy raced through Cedar Ridge's streets, wheels clattering on the frozen dirt. Margaret looked back to see Sterling and his men gaining their horses faster than the buggy's single mare. They headed for the courthouse where Marshal Cooper was supposed to be waiting. But the courthouse was 6 blocks away, and their pursuers were closing fast. One of Sterling's men pulled alongside, reaching for the buggy's side. Anna swerved hard, the buggy tilting dangerously. Margaret clung to the seat with one hand, the satchel with the other, praying they would not overturn. Then suddenly there were other riders coming from side streets. Samuel Owen on his old gelding, Jacob Winters and 2 of his brothers, 3 of the families who had lost land to Sterling. They formed a barrier between the buggy and its pursuers, forcing Sterling's men to slow or risk collision. Margaret looked back to see the chaos, saw Samuel standing in his stirrups and shouting something she could not hear. The distraction bought them precious seconds. Anna turned the corner toward the courthouse, and there on the steps stood Marshal Samuel Cooper, his hand on his pistol, his federal badge gleaming in the afternoon sun. Sterling and his men pulled up short horses, rearing. Cooper descended the courthouse steps slowly, his face carved from granite. "That's far enough, gentlemen," Cooper said, his voice carrying absolute authority. "This is federal property, and I'm a federal officer. Anyone who crosses that line is subject to arrest." Sterling's face was purple with rage. "That woman stole documents from my private office. I demand her arrest for theft and trespassing." Cooper looked at Margaret, who had climbed down from the buggy, still clutching the satchel. "What documents, Mrs. Blackwood?" "Evidence of bribery, conspiracy, and fraud, Marshal," Margaret said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Letters in Mr. Sterling's own handwriting proving he orchestrated the false charges against my husband. A ledger documenting years of illegal payments to judges and law enforcement. Everything needed to prove systematic corruption." "Those are private business records," Sterling snarled. "She had no right to take them." Cooper held out his hand to Margaret. "May I see them, ma'am?" Margaret handed over the satchel. Cooper pulled out the letter she had found, the one with explicit instructions for planting evidence on Ethan's property. He read it slowly, his expression never changing, but something dangerous flickered in his eyes. "This letter," Cooper said, "written in your hand and bearing your seal, contains explicit instructions for framing an innocent man. That's conspiracy to commit fraud, Mr. Sterling. That's obstruction of justice. That's a federal crime." A crowd had gathered, drawn by the commotion. Citizens of Cedar Ridge, miners and shopkeepers and families, all watching as one of the most powerful men in West Virginia was publicly confronted with his crimes. Sterling looked around at the crowd, at Cooper's drawn pistol, at Margaret standing defiant with the evidence in hand. For the first time in his life, Victor Sterling realized he had lost. "Victor Sterling," Cooper said, his voice formal and final, "you're under arrest." As Cooper's deputies moved forward to take Sterling into custody, Margaret felt her knees start to buckle. The adrenaline that had carried her through the past hour was draining away, leaving her shaking and weak. Then she felt it, a sharp pain in her abdomen, different from the baby's usual movements. She looked down to see blood spreading across her skirt. Too much blood. "Anna," she gasped. "Something's wrong." The last thing Margaret saw before darkness claimed her was Anna's frightened face and the winter sky above Cedar Ridge, gray and distant and indifferent to human suffering. Margaret woke to unfamiliar surroundings. Afternoon light slanted through lace curtains she did not recognize. For a moment she was disoriented, unsure where she was or how much time had passed. Then memory flooded back in a rush that left her gasping. The office, the chase, the blood. Her hand flew to her belly. "The baby!" A figure moved at her bedside. Anna Brennan's weathered face swam into focus, and Margaret saw relief flood the older woman's features. "Baby is fine," Anna said quickly, pressing Margaret's shoulders gently back against the pillows. "You're both fine. But it was close, Margaret. Too close." Margaret felt tears of relief streaming down her face. Her hands moved over her rounded belly, and she felt a strong kick in response, as if the baby was reassuring her of its presence. "How long have I been here?" "2 days," Anna said. "You're in the home of Judge Thaddeus Morgan. He and his wife insisted you stay here while you recover. They've been very kind." "And Ethan?" Margaret tried to sit up, but dizziness forced her back down. Anna's face broke into a smile. "They brought him from Pine Hollow yesterday. The charges have been dropped. Sterling confessed to everything once he realized the evidence against him was overwhelming. Deputy Morrison is in custody too. Your husband is free, Margaret. You did it." The words washed over Margaret like a benediction. Free. Ethan was free. Their baby was safe. Sterling would face justice. After weeks of terror and struggle, it was finally over. But even as relief flooded through her, a small voice in the back of her mind reminded her that one threat still remained. The Hayes lawyers in Boston still believed they had rights to her child. That battle was not yet won. As if reading her thoughts, Anna handed her an envelope. "This came this morning from Boston." Margaret opened it with trembling fingers. The letter inside was brief and formal. "Mrs. Margaret Blackwood." It began, using her correct married name for the first time. "Upon further investigation, we have confirmed that you were legally married to Ethan Blackwood prior to conceiving the child in question. As such, the Hayes family withdraws all claims to custody. We apologize for any distress this matter may have caused." The letter was signed by Cornelius Hayes himself. Marshal Cooper paid them a visit, Anna explained with satisfaction. "Showed them copies of your marriage certificate and had some strong words about attempting to steal children based on false information. Apparently the Hayes family was quite embarrassed to learn they had been used as pawns in Sterling's scheme." Margaret felt the last knot of tension in her chest finally release. It was truly over. All of it. Ethan was free. The baby was safe. Their enemies were defeated. Against impossible odds, they had won. There was a soft knock at the door. Anna opened it, and Ethan stepped into the room. He looked thinner after his weeks in jail. his beard grown wild dark circles under his eyes from sleepless nights. But his eyes were bright with emotion, alive in a way Margaret had never seen before. He crossed to the bed in 3 long strides and sank to his knees beside it, his massive frame trembling. "Margaret." He breathed her name like a prayer, his large hands framing her face with infinite gentleness. "They told me what you did, how you risked yourself and our child to save me. When they told me you collapsed, that there was blood, I thought I would go mad in that cell." "But we're here," Margaret said, covering his hands with hers. "We're safe, and you're free. Because of you," Ethan said, his voice breaking. "Because you refused to give up or back down. Because you're the strongest, bravest woman I've ever known." He leaned his forehead against hers, and Margaret felt the tremor running through his massive frame, all the fear and love and relief pouring between them without words. Then he kissed her softly at first, then with growing passion, everything they had been too afraid to say, finding expression in that kiss. When they finally pulled apart, both were crying. "I love you," Ethan said, the words raw and honest. "Not because you're my wife or the mother of my child, though I treasure both those things. I love you because you saw me, really saw me, when no one else ever has. You taught me that I was worthy of being fought for. And I love you," Margaret replied, her voice thick with emotion. "You taught me that love isn't something buried with the past, that it can grow wild and strong like these mountains, that it's worth fighting for, worth risking everything for." They sat together in the quiet room, hands linked, while outside the winter sun set over Cedar Ridge in shades of gold and crimson. They had walked through fire and emerged stronger for it. Their faith in each other had been tested and proven unbreakable. 3 weeks later, on December 20th, the federal courthouse in Cedar Ridge hosted what would become the most attended hearing in West Virginia history. Word had spread throughout the region about the trial of Victor Sterling, and farmers and miners had traveled for days to witness what many saw as a test of whether honest citizens could still find justice in a system increasingly controlled by corporate interests. The courthouse was packed to capacity with standing room only. People lined the walls, crowded the doorways, pressed against the windows from outside. Reporters from 3 states had descended on Cedar Ridge, their notebooks ready to document what happened. Margaret sat in the front row now, clearly showing her pregnancy at 19 weeks. Beside her sat Ethan, free for 3 weeks now, but still adjusting to the reality that his ordeal was truly over. His large hand engulfed hers, a connection that had become as natural as breathing. Behind them sat their allies: Samuel Owen, Helen Cooper, Anna Brennan, Jacob Winters with his wife and children, the families who had lost land to Sterling, everyone who had fought beside them. Judge Thaddeus Morgan presided, a stern man of 62 who had built a reputation throughout the territory as incorruptible. His sharp eyes surveyed the packed courtroom, missing nothing. He brought his gavel down once, the sound cutting through the murmur of voices like a knife. "This court will come to order," he said, his voice carrying absolute authority. "We are here to determine the guilt or innocence of Victor Sterling on charges of bribery, conspiracy to commit fraud, and obstruction of justice. We will also address the matter of Ethan Blackwood, who was falsely accused as part of this conspiracy." Marshal Samuel Cooper stood to present the prosecution's case. His presentation was methodical and devastating, building a picture of corruption so systematic it took the breath away. 6 families in 3 years, Cooper said, his voice steady and implacable. All targeted after geological surveys revealed valuable coal deposits on their properties. All arrested on false charges involving Deputy Frank Morrison or his associates. All lost their land to Sterling Coal Company within months of arrest. He projected a timeline on a large board at the front of the courtroom, showing the pattern repeating across 6 different families: survey, crime, arrest, property transfer. The visual evidence was undeniable. Then came the physical evidence. The ledger Margaret had taken from Sterling's office, showing years of bribes paid to judges, sheriffs, and deputies. Cooper read each entry aloud, his voice never wavering. Judge William Cartwright, $1,000. Deputy Frank Morrison, $500. Sheriff Thomas Morrison, $250 monthly. The courtroom erupted in angry murmurs with each name. Judge Morgan gavelled for silence, but did not seem displeased by the reaction. These were citizens seeing the scope of corruption that had infected their justice system. But it was the letter that sealed Sterling's fate. Cooper held it up so everyone could see Sterling's signature and company seal. I will now read into the record a letter written by Victor Sterling to Deputy Frank Morrison, dated 3 weeks before Ethan Blackwood's arrest. He read slowly, letting each word land with full weight. Arrange for the planting of 20 red oak logs marked with federal property stamps on the Blackwood property. Timing must coincide with the half-breed's absence. Ensure witnesses can testify to discovery. Payment of $500 upon completion and arrest. The courtroom exploded, people shouting, some standing, the noise rising to a roar. Judge Morgan had to gavel repeatedly for order, and even then it took several minutes for the crowd to settle. Sterling sat at the defense table, his face ashen. His expensive Charleston lawyers exchanged glances, knowing they had lost before they even began. The defense tried to argue that the documents had been obtained illegally, that Margaret's actions constituted theft, and therefore the evidence should be inadmissible. But Cooper was prepared for that argument. Mrs. Blackwood was acting as a civilian investigator assisting a federal officer in an ongoing corruption investigation, he stated firmly. The evidence she obtained is admissible under Federal Statute 23-41, which allows for citizen participation in uncovering crimes against the public good. He paused, letting that sink in. More importantly, the defendant confessed under questioning immediately after his arrest. His own words condemned him. We could argue about the admissibility of documents all day, but it won't change the fact that Victor Sterling admitted to conspiracy, bribery, and obstruction of justice. The defense had no response to that. Then came the witness testimony. Jacob Winters took the stand looking smaller, somehow diminished by the weight of what he had done. He spoke in a quiet voice, but every word carried clearly in the silent courtroom. I was paid $100 by Deputy Morrison to move stolen timber onto Ethan Blackwood's property. He said, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. I knew it was wrong. I did it anyway because my family was starving. I have 6 children to feed and my brother's widow to support. But that doesn't excuse what I did. I helped destroy an innocent man's life for money. His voice broke, tears streaming down his weathered face. I'm sorry. I know those words aren't enough, but they're all I have. Ethan Blackwood is a better man than I'll ever be. He deserves justice. The defense attorney tried to discredit Jacob, painting him as a paid liar seeking immunity. But bank records showed the $100 deposit into Jacob's account the day after the timber was moved. Morrison's own ledger showed the payment made to Jacob right alongside dozens of other transactions. The evidence backed up every word of Jacob's testimony. When Margaret was called to testify, she walked to the stand with her hand protectively over her swollen belly. She wore a simple blue dress that Helen had sewn for her, practical and modest. Her graying hair was pulled back in her customary bun. She looked exactly like what she was, a respectable schoolteacher and expectant mother. But when she began to speak, the steel in her voice made it clear she was also a woman who had faced down corruption and won. She described her investigation methodically, presenting each piece of evidence like a teacher walking students through a complex problem. The pattern she had discovered, the connection between geological surveys and false arrests, her interview with Jacob Winters, her research into land records. Then she described the day she had gone to Sterling's office. I knew it was dangerous, she said calmly, her hands folded in her lap. I knew I might be caught. But my husband was facing 5 years in prison for a crime he did not commit. My unborn child would have grown up without knowing her father. I could not sit idle while that happened. The defense attorney tried to rattle her, suggesting she had fabricated evidence, that she was a hysterical woman driven by emotion rather than reason. Margaret responded to each accusation with calm logic and documented facts. I spent 15 years teaching children how to think clearly and argue effectively. she said at one point, a slight smile touching her lips. A hostile lawyer is nothing compared to a classroom of skeptical 12-year-olds. Laughter rippled through the courtroom, and even Judge Morgan's stern face softened slightly. Margaret had won the room. When she mentioned the letter from the Hayes lawyers explaining how Sterling had deliberately fed them false information to create a second front of harassment, the courtroom erupted again. Even Sterling's expensive attorneys seemed taken aback by the depth of their client's conspiracy. Then came the moment that transformed the hearing from a simple corruption case into something larger. Reverend Thomas Bradford stood up in the gallery. "Your Honor, may I speak?" Judge Morgan looked surprised but nodded. "You may approach." The elderly minister walked to the front of the courtroom, his weathered Bible clutched in one hand. But he did not address the judge. He turned to face the assembled crowd. "I have been the minister of Pine Hollow for 37 years," he said, his voice carrying the weight of age and authority. "I have married couples, buried children, and counseled families through every kind of hardship. I thought I knew what evil looked like, but I did not truly understand it until I watched Victor Sterling systematically destroy good people for profit." His voice grew stronger, more passionate. "Ethan Blackwood is a man of Cherokee and European blood. Some see that as shameful. I see it as a gift from God, the joining of two peoples into something stronger than either alone. He has lived his life with more honor and dignity than most of us ever will." He pointed at Sterling, his finger steady despite his age. "And this man tried to destroy him because money mattered more than justice, because he saw another human being as an obstacle rather than a person." One by one others stood. Anna Brennan spoke in careful English about how Sterling had stolen her family's land. The Morrison family, the O'Briens, the Washingtons, each telling their story of false accusations and lost homes. Samuel Owen spoke of watching Ethan grow up fatherless, of how the boy had carved toys for other children, even as those same children mocked him. The testimony painted a picture of systematic cruelty that went beyond simple greed into something darker. Sterling had not just wanted land and money. He had wanted to eliminate anyone he deemed inferior to reshape the mountains in his image. Finally, Ethan himself was called to testify. He stood at the witness stand, his 8-foot frame making even the elevated platform seem small. He wore his best suit, the same one he had married Margaret in, and his long black hair was neatly tied back. When he spoke, his deep voice carried easily through the room. The defense attorney asked him to describe his relationship with the land Sterling had wanted. "My mother is buried there," Ethan said simply, his voice soft but clear, "on a hill overlooking the valley. Every morning I watch the sun rise over her grave and remember the lessons she taught me. That land isn't just property to me, it's home, it's memory, it's everything my mother worked for and died protecting." He looked directly at Sterling, for the first time his dark eyes holding the other man's gaze. "You saw numbers on a map, dollars in coal deposits. I see the place where my mother sang Cherokee songs and taught me to carve wood. You can't put a price on that, no matter how many millions you think are buried there." The courtroom was absolutely silent. People who had come expecting a simple corruption case were witnessing something more profound, a clash between two visions of what mattered in life. The defense attorney pressed on, perhaps trying to paint Ethan as violent or dangerous. "Mr. Blackwood, you're an unusually large man with considerable strength. Have you ever used that strength to harm others?" Ethan was quiet for a moment, considering his answer carefully. "I've used my strength to work, to build, to protect. My mother taught me that size without gentleness is tyranny, that power without compassion is evil." "But do you hate Mr. Sterling for what he did to you?" the attorney asked. Ethan looked at Sterling again, and something complicated moved across his face. Pain, pity, understanding. "No," he said finally. "I pity him. A man who would destroy families for money is already destroyed inside. He's made himself into someone who can't see value in anything that can't be counted or spent. That's a poverty worse than anything I've ever experienced." Even Sterling seemed shaken by those words. In the gallery, Margaret felt tears streaming down her face. This man, her husband, had suffered so much at Sterling's hands, had been falsely imprisoned, had his freedom and reputation threatened, had nearly lost everything. And still, he chose understanding over hatred. Judge Morgan called for closing arguments. The prosecution's case was straightforward, the evidence overwhelming. The defense tried to argue about technicalities and procedural issues, but their hearts were not in it. They knew they had lost. The judge retired to his chambers for less than an hour. When he returned, his face was grim but determined. "I have reviewed all evidence and testimony presented in this case," he said, his voice formal and final. "The pattern of corruption is clear, documented, and admitted by the defendant himself." He looked directly at Sterling. "Victor Sterling, you stand convicted of bribery of public officials, conspiracy to commit fraud, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy to deprive citizens of their property through illegal means." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the courtroom. "You are sentenced to 20 years in federal prison without possibility of parole." The courtroom erupted in cheers and applause. Judge Morgan gavelled for order but did not seem displeased by the reaction. "Furthermore," he continued when the noise died down, "Sterling Coal Company is hereby barred from operating in West Virginia. All properties acquired through illegal means in the past 5 years are to be returned to their original owners or their heirs." More cheers, more applause. Families who had lost everything seeing justice finally served. Judge Morgan turned his attention to another figure in the courtroom. "As for Jacob Winters, this court recognizes that you came forward voluntarily to testify against powerful interests despite threats to your family. Your cooperation was essential to justice. You will serve 6 months of supervised community service but no prison time. Use this second chance wisely." Jacob's shoulders sagged with relief, tears streaming down his face. He looked at Ethan across the courtroom, his eyes begging forgiveness. Ethan met his gaze and nodded once slowly. It was not absolution, but it was understanding. Both men knew what it meant to be desperate to make hard choices to seek redemption. Finally, Judge Morgan addressed Ethan. "All charges against Ethan Blackwood are dismissed with prejudice. This court formally apologizes for the injustice done to him and his family. Mr. Blackwood, you are free and your name is clear." Ethan stood and Margaret stood with him, her hand in his, their unborn child safe between them. Around them people were crying, laughing, embracing. Justice had been served not just for Ethan and Margaret, but for every family Sterling had destroyed. As they left the courthouse walking into the winter sunshine, Margaret felt their baby kick hard as if celebrating. She looked up at Ethan and saw tears streaming down his face. "Are you all right?" she asked softly. "I'm better than all right," Ethan said, his voice thick with emotion. "For the first time in my life I feel like I belong, like I matter, not because of what I can lift or how tall I stand, but because of who I am. You gave me that, Margaret. You and this community that fought beside us." "You always mattered, Ethan," Margaret said, reaching up to wipe the tears from his face. "You just needed the world to catch up to what I already knew." But the day was not quite over. As they stood on the courthouse steps, savoring their victory, Victor Sterling was being led away in chains. He should have gone quietly, a defeated man accepting his fate. But something in him broke in that moment. Perhaps it was the humiliation of public defeat. Perhaps it was the hatred that had consumed him for so long finally burning away his sanity. For a moment, it seemed over. Sterling stood defeated between 2 deputies, shoulders slumped, the fight gone out of him. The crowd began to disperse, voices rising in celebration. Then something in Sterling's eyes changed. A wild, desperate gleam. He had spent 30 years building his empire, destroying anyone who stood in his way. He could not, would not accept defeat at the hands of a schoolteacher and a half-breed giant. "If I can't have that land," he hissed, and his hand moved with shocking speed to his boot, "then no one will." The knife appeared as if by magic, and Sterling broke free from the surprised deputies with the manic strength of a cornered animal. He lunged toward Margaret, the blade aimed with terrible precision at her swollen belly. His hand went to his boot, and when it came up, there was a knife. A small blade easily concealed, kept as a last resort. "If I can't have that land, no one will," he screamed, the knife aimed at Margaret's pregnant belly. Everything happened in an instant that seemed to stretch into eternity. Ethan saw the knife, saw the trajectory, saw that he could not reach Margaret in time to pull her away. So he did the only thing he could. He threw himself between his wife and the blade. The knife caught Ethan below the ribs on his left side. Not deep, his massive frame and the angle saving him from serious injury, but painful. Blood bloomed across his shirt. But Ethan did not fall. He grabbed Sterling's wrist with one enormous hand, squeezing until bones cracked and the knife clattered to the ground. With his other hand, Ethan lifted Sterling by the throat, raising the older man off his feet like he weighed nothing. For a moment, they were frozen in a terrible tableau. The giant holding the man who had tried to destroy him. Sterling's feet dangling, his face turning purple, his eyes bulging with terror. The crowd fell silent, watching. Ethan could kill Sterling now. Everyone saw it. One squeeze and Sterling would be dead. Justice of a more permanent kind. No one would blame him. In the gallery, Margaret pressed her hand to her belly, watching her husband at this crucial moment, waiting to see what he would choose. Ethan looked into Sterling's terrified eyes and saw not a powerful man, but a pathetic one, a man so consumed by greed and hatred that he had destroyed himself long before this moment. And Ethan realized something fundamental about himself. "You're not worth it," he said quietly, and lowered Sterling to the ground. Deputies rushed forward, grabbing Sterling, who collapsed the moment Ethan released him. The older man curled into himself, whimpering, all his power and arrogance gone, reduced to what he had always been beneath the expensive clothes and false dignity. A small, mean man who had hurt people because he could. Ethan swayed, the adrenaline fading, leaving behind pain and blood loss. Margaret was at his side instantly, her hands pressing against the wound. "Someone get Dr. Howard," she shouted. "He's bleeding." Dr. Howard, the new town physician, pushed through the crowd. He examined Ethan quickly, his experienced hands probing the wound. "The knife missed anything vital. He'll need stitches and rest, but he'll survive." They took Ethan to Dr. Howard's office, where the doctor cleaned and stitched the wound while Margaret held her husband's hand. Ethan bore the pain in silence, his jaw clenched, sweat beading on his forehead. When it was done, Dr. Howard wrapped his torso in bandages and gave him laudanum for the pain. "You're lucky," the doctor said. "Another inch to the right and that blade would have punctured your lung. As it is, you'll be sore for a few weeks, but you'll heal completely." "Can I go home?" Ethan asked, his voice tired but determined. "Tomorrow," Dr. Howard said. "I want to watch you overnight to make sure there's no infection setting in. But yes, tomorrow you can go home." That night, Margaret sat beside Ethan's bed in Dr. Howard's small clinic, holding his hand while he dozed fitfully. She thought about everything that had happened since that stormy October night when he had saved her life. The pregnancy, the rushed marriage, the arrest, the investigation, the trial, and now this final violence that could have ended in tragedy. But they had survived. Against all odds, against corruption and power and the cruelty of desperate men, they had survived. And more than survived, they had won. The next morning they returned to Pine Hollow in a wagon driven by Samuel Owen. The town turned out to welcome them home. Children waved, women called out blessings, men tipped their hats with genuine respect. Ethan was no longer the mountain ghost to be feared. He was the man who had stood against injustice and won, the husband of the brave teacher who had risked everything for him. When they reached their cabin, Ethan helped Margaret down from the wagon with careful gentleness, mindful of both his injury and her pregnancy. They stood together on their porch, looking out at the mountains they both loved. "We're home," Margaret said softly. "We're home," Ethan agreed. That night they lay in their bed, careful of Ethan's wound, but needing the comfort of closeness. Margaret rested her head on Ethan's shoulder, her hand on her belly where their child grew strong and safe. "Do you remember that night in the storm?" she asked, "when you found me freezing to death? I remember thinking you were going to die," Ethan said, his arm tightening around her, "that I had to save you." "You did save me," Margaret said. "But not the way you thought. You saved me from a half-life, from going through the motions without really living. You gave me purpose and passion and a family worth fighting for." "And you gave me something I'd never had," Ethan replied. "A place to belong. Knowledge that I'm more than what people see, that I'm worthy of love." They lay in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the wind in the pines, the crackling of the fire in the hearth. Outside, snow began to fall again, covering the mountains in white. "Ethan," Margaret said after a while. "Yes. When you had Sterling by the throat, you could have killed him. Why didn't you—" Ethan was quiet for a long moment, thinking about his answer. "Because I kept thinking about our child, about what kind of father I want to be, and I realized that if I killed him, even if it was justified, I would be teaching our daughter that vengeance matters more than justice. That strength is for taking life rather than protecting it." He turned to look at Margaret, his dark eyes serious. "My father left because he thought I was a monster. I spent my whole life afraid I might be right. But you taught me I'm not. You taught me that true strength is knowing when not to use your power. And I wanted to be worthy of you and our child." Margaret kissed him then deeply and tenderly. "You already are," she whispered. "You always have been." 2 months later, in early March of 1885, Margaret went into labor. Anna Brennan attended her as midwife along with Dr. Howard, who had agreed to be present given Margaret's age and the complications she had suffered during the investigation. The labor was long, 8 hours of pain and effort, but Margaret bore it with the same determination she had brought to everything else in her life. Ethan paced outside the bedroom, unable to sit still, carving a piece of wood with swift, nervous strokes. By the time Anna called him in, he had completed an entire cradle, intricate and beautiful, made without conscious thought, while his mind was consumed with worry. When he entered the bedroom, Margaret was propped up against the pillows, exhausted but glowing with triumph. In her arms was a tiny baby, impossibly small, with a shock of dark hair and bright eyes that seemed to focus on him with surprising intensity. "Meet your daughter," Margaret said, tears streaming down her face. "Meet Sarah Blackwood, named for your mother." Ethan approached slowly, almost reverently, as if afraid his size might somehow damage this precious new life. Margaret placed the baby in his enormous hands, and Sarah looked impossibly small against his broad palms, like a doll made of flesh and breath. "Hello, little Sarah," Ethan whispered, his voice breaking with emotion. "I'm your papa, and I promise you'll never doubt you're loved. You'll never feel unwanted or like you don't belong. You'll grow up knowing your mother is the bravest woman who ever lived, and your father would move mountains to keep you safe." The baby wrapped one tiny hand around Ethan's finger, gripping with surprising strength. He made a sound that was half laugh, half sob, overwhelmed by the perfection of this small person they had created. "She's so small," he said, awed. "So perfect. How did we make something so perfect?" "With love," Margaret said softly. "We made her with love." In the months that followed, life settled into a new rhythm at the Blackwood cabin. Ethan expanded the house, adding a nursery for Sarah and a study where Margaret could read and write. She had resigned from teaching not because anyone asked her to, but because she wanted time with her daughter. The school board had begged her to reconsider, but Margaret was firm. She had spent 15 years nurturing other people's children. Now it was time to nurture her own. Sarah proved to be a strong baby, thriving despite the dramatic circumstances of her first months. She had her father's dark hair and eyes, her mother's determined jaw. By 6 months, she was crawling. By 9 months, pulling herself up on furniture. By her first birthday, she was taking wobbly steps, while Ethan hovered nervously behind her, ready to catch her if she fell. The community of Pine Hollow changed too. Ethan was no longer the ghost to be feared and avoided. He was the man who had been wronged and vindicated, the husband of the brave teacher who had taken down Victor Sterling. People nodded respectfully when he came to town. Children no longer whispered and pointed. Some even asked if he would teach them to carve wood like he did. Every Saturday morning, Ethan began holding carving lessons in his barn. 5 or 6 children would show up eager to learn. He taught them with patience and gentleness, showing them how to see the animal hidden in the wood, how to coax it out with careful strokes of the blade. It brought him joy to see these children who once feared him now listening to his quiet voice and trying to imitate his skilled hands. The families whose land had been returned by court order formed a cooperative to resist future corporate pressure. They elected Ethan to represent them on the newly formed Appalachian Land Council, an organization dedicated to protecting mountain families from exploitation. It meant travel and meetings responsibilities Ethan had never imagined having. But he accepted, knowing his fight had been about more than just saving his own land. It had been about protecting everyone. Jacob Winters completed his community service and began working with the Land Council as a liaison to the logging community. His relationship with Ethan would never be friendship. The betrayal was too fresh, but it was something. Mutual respect, mutual understanding of what it meant to make mistakes and seek redemption. Jacob's children sometimes came to Ethan's Saturday carving lessons, and Ethan taught them with the same patience he showed all the children. Victor Sterling died in federal prison in the spring of 1895, 10 years into his sentence. A heart attack, quick and final. His assets had been liquidated, the victims he had destroyed compensated as much as money could compensate. His legacy became a cautionary tale told throughout West Virginia, a warning of what happened when greed consumed a man's soul. On a warm evening in June of 1886, Ethan and Margaret sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. Sarah played at their feet now, 15 months old, babbling to the wooden bear her father had carved for her. Margaret's hand rested on the small swell of her belly, 3 months pregnant with their second child. "Do you remember that night in the storm?" Margaret asked, as she sometimes did. "When you found me freezing to death." "I remember thinking you were going to die," Ethan said, as he always did, "that I had to save you." "You did save me," Margaret said, "but not the way you thought. You saved me from a half-life, from going through the motions without really living. You gave me purpose and passion and a reason to fight." Ethan took her hand, his massive fingers intertwining with her slender ones. "And you gave me something I'd never had, a family, a place to belong. Knowledge that I'm more than what people see when they look at me." Sarah toddled over, holding up her bear. "Papa, Mama." Margaret scooped her daughter into her lap, and Ethan wrapped his arms around both of them. They sat that way as the sun sank behind the mountains, 3 people who had found each other against all odds and built something worth defending. In the years to come, the Blackwood family would become a legend in those mountains, not because they were perfect or powerful, but because they proved that ordinary people armed with courage and love and unshakable determination could stand against corruption and win. William Blackwood was born in December of 1886, a son with his mother's hazel eyes and his father's Cherokee features. The cabin rang with the laughter of 2 children, with the sound of Ethan's carving knife and Margaret's voice reading stories. Sometimes in the evening quiet, Margaret would take out the wooden bear Ethan had carved for her that first night, worn smooth from years of handling, and remember. She remembered the storm that had brought them together, the fear and the rescue, the awkward early days of their marriage, the battles they had fought side by side, the battles they had fought, the life they had built. She remembered that courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. That love was not something buried with the past, but something that grew wild and strong like the mountains themselves. That justice, while slow and hard won, was worth fighting for with everything you had. And on a porch in the year 1942, an old man finished his story. And that Jimmy, Ethan said, his 90-year-old voice tired but satisfied, is how your grandmother and I fought Victor Sterling and won. Jimmy sat in awed silence, trying to process everything he had heard. "Grandpa, that's incredible. You really did all that, fought those men, saved Grandma, stopped Sterling." Ethan smiled, the expression softening his weathered face. "I did what any man would do for his family, son. That's the lesson I want you to remember." He leaned forward in his rocking chair, his voice taking on the weight of hard-won wisdom. "Life will test you, Jimmy. Powerful people will try to crush you. Systems will fail you. But if you have love worth fighting for, you fight. No matter the cost, no matter the odds. You stand up and you fight. "What happened to Grandma Margaret?" Jimmy asked softly. Ethan's smile turned sad. "She passed 5 years ago, 1937. We had 52 years together. She was 95 years old and died peacefully in her sleep right in that bedroom." He pointed to the cabin behind them. "I held her hand until the end. And Sarah, my mom—" "Your mother is 57 now," Ethan said with pride, "living in Charleston. She became a lawyer, first woman admitted to the West Virginia bar. She fights for families like we did, keeps Sterling types from hurting people. She has her mother's fire and my stubbornness." "And Uncle William—" Ethan's face grew somber. "Your uncle died in France, World War I, 1918. He was only 31 years old, but he was brave. He saved his whole platoon. I was proud of him." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of history settling around them. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky the same gold and crimson it had been 58 years ago when a young couple first sat on this porch together. "Jimmy," Ethan said, his voice taking on the tone of final wisdom, "I'm 90 years old now. I've lived through 2 world wars, the Depression, more pain and joy than most men see in 3 lifetimes. He paused, looking out at the mountains he had known for 9 decades. "But that year, 1884 to 1885, that was when I truly became a man. Not because I was big or strong or could fight, because I learned what really matters: family, honor, justice, love. Everything else is just noise." "Thank you for telling me, Grandpa," Jimmy said. Ethan reached into his pocket and pulled out a wooden bear, the same design he had carved for Margaret 58 years ago. He handed it to his grandson. "Take this," he said. "Remember what I told you. You're a Blackwood. We don't run. We don't quit. We fight for what we love." He paused, his eyes twinkling. "Now go. Your grandmother would want you to live, not just listen to old stories." Jimmy stood clutching the wooden bear and impulsively hugged his grandfather. "I love you, Grandpa." "I love you too, boy," Ethan said, returning the embrace with careful gentleness. "Now get going before I get sentimental." Jimmy left, walking down the mountain path toward town. Ethan watched him go, then settled back in his rocking chair. The sun continued its descent, shadows lengthening across the porch. He looked at the shelf visible through the window, at the wooden animals he had carved over 58 years. At the photograph of Margaret young and smiling, taken on their 10th anniversary. At Sarah's baby cradle, preserved all these decades. His hand moved to touch the small table beside his chair, where another photograph sat. Margaret in her final years, gray-haired and wrinkled, but with eyes still bright with intelligence and love. He picked it up, holding it with the same gentle care he had always used with precious things. "I'm coming, Margaret," he whispered to the photograph. "Not today, but soon. Wait for me." The sun set completely, stars beginning to emerge in the darkening sky. Ethan Blackwood sat on his porch, surrounded by memories and love, at peace with the life he had lived and the legacy he was leaving behind. On October 28, 1942, exactly 58 years after the night he found Margaret freezing to death in the blizzard, Ethan Blackwood died peacefully in his sleep. He was 90 years old. They found him in his rocking chair on the porch, the photograph of Margaret still clutched in his hands, a slight smile on his weathered face. They buried him beside his mother Sarah and his wife Margaret on the hill overlooking the valley, just as he had always wanted. The funeral drew hundreds of people, not just from Pine Hollow, but from across West Virginia, people whose families he had helped, children he had taught to carve, members of the Appalachian Land Council he had helped found. His daughter Sarah spoke at the funeral, her voice strong despite her tears. "My father taught me that courage isn't about being fearless, it's about being afraid and doing what's right anyway. He taught me that love is the most powerful force in the world. And he taught me that one person standing up for justice can change everything." The land remained in the Blackwood family. Sarah's children and their children continue to live on that mountain, protecting it, as Ethan once did. The Appalachian Land Council still operates, still fighting to protect mountain families from exploitation. And in courtrooms across West Virginia, lawyers fighting for the powerless sometimes invoke the name of Ethan Blackwood, the mountain giant who proved that justice could triumph over corruption. His story lived on, told around fires, passed down through generations. A reminder that the smallest voice raised in defense of truth can echo through the mountains forever, inspiring others to stand up and speak out and refuse to let fear silence what is right. The mountains remember everything, and they remember the gentle giant and the schoolteacher who refused to let the world break them, who built a family on love and justice and hope that could not be bought or sold or stolen away. Their story had ended, but their legacy had just begun.